Imagine standing at the edge of an ancient library, its shelves lined with crumbling scrolls and faded manuscripts, each one holding secrets of people whose names have vanished from memory. Some were heroes who changed the course of history with quiet acts of bravery. Others were villains whose schemes sent empires crumbling, yet their stories, once whispered in crowded marketplaces or etched into palace walls, have slipped through the cracks of time. Today, we're dusting off those forgotten pages to bring you 45 legends figures who shaped civilizations, then disappeared into the shadows. Think about the last time you heard a story that sent chills down your spine, a tale so gripping you couldn't believe it wasn't common knowledge. That's the power of these forgotten legends. From ruthless conquerors who rewrote maps with blood and fire, to selfless healers who defied plagues and prejudice, their lives are a mirror held up to our own. What can we learn from a queen who ruled with unmatched cunning, only to be erased by her rivals, or a rebel whose defiance sparked revolutions, yet never earned a footnote in textbooks? These aren't just dusty old anecdotes, they're blueprints of human nature, showing us the heights of courage and the depths of deceit. So why do these stories matter now, in a world obsessed with the future? Because history isn't just a record of what happened, it's a compass. When we uncover these lost voices, we see patterns, ambition that topples kingdoms, love that outlasts wars, ideas that refuse to die. This video is your invitation to walk alongside these forgotten legends, to hear their whispers across the centuries. By the end, you won't just remember their names, you'll understand why they were silenced and why it's time to speak them again. The past is waiting, let's bring it back to life. History has a way of playing favorites, shining its spotlight on some while leaving others in the dark. But what exactly pushes a figure from the center stage of memory into the wings of oblivion? Sometimes it's as simple as bad timing. Imagine a brilliant inventor whose breakthroughs came just years after a more famous rival, their achievements buried under the weight of someone else's legacy. Other times it's far more deliberate. Conquerors rewrite history, scrubbing away the names of those who opposed them. Empires collapse, taking their records with them. And let's not forget the quiet bias of time itself. Stories from marginalized communities, women, or lesser-known regions often slip through the cracks, deemed unimportant by those who held the pens. Take, for example, the countless healers and scholars of the ancient world whose remedies and ideas were credited to more prominent men, or the rebels whose uprisings threatened the powerful, only to have their very existence struck from official chronicles. These aren't just missing pieces, they're gaping holes in our understanding of how societies rose and fell. Rediscovering them isn't just about filling in blanks, it's about challenging the narratives we've been handed. What if the barbarians history vilified were actually visionaries? What if the so-called villains were simply on the losing side of a propaganda war? This is why forgotten legends matter. They force us to question whose truth we've been taught. Every erased name is a thread pulled from the tapestry of history, leaving the picture incomplete. But when we tug at those threads, whole new patterns emerge, stories of resilience from silenced voices, acts of courage from those written off as footnotes. By bringing them back into the light, we don't just honor their memory, we rewrite what it means to remember. Every society holds up its heroes like lanterns in the dark figures whose lives seem to glow with the virtues we cherish most. A hero might be the general who turned the tide of a hopeless battle, the scientist who cracked a code that saved millions, or the ordinary person who stood against injustice when no one else dared. Their stories aren't just told, they're polished like heirlooms, passed down to teach each new generation what courage or compassion looks like. But here's what's fascinating. Heroes aren't just born from their actions. They're shaped by the times that need them. A farmer who smuggled food to starving neighbors during a famine might fade into obscurity in peacetime, but in crisis, their kindness becomes legend. Then there are the villains, the names spoken in hushed tones, the ones whose deeds are held up as warnings, a tyrant who hoarded wealth while his people starved. A traitor who sold secrets for power. These aren't just bad people, they're mirrors reflecting the worst of human nature. Societies remember them not to glorify their cruelty, but to remind themselves, this is what happens when we let greed or fear take over. Yet even here, history plays tricks. The pirate queen, denounced as a criminal by her enemies, might be celebrated as a freedom fighter by her own people. The revolutionary, labeled a terrorist in one century, becomes a national hero in the next. That's the slippery truth about heroes and villains. They're never fixed. A conqueror praised for uniting a continent might later be condemned for the bloodshed it took to do it. A philosopher revered for wisdom in their lifetime could be dismissed as a fraud generations later. The labels we give them say as much about us as they do about them. What does it mean when a culture elevates warriors over healers or rebels over rulers? Whose stories get amplified and whose are pushed to the margins? Take the tale of two figures from the same war. One hailed as a hero for leading their side to victory, the other vilified as a butcher for the very same tactics. Flip the perspective and their roles reverse. This isn't just about bias, it's about how history is a conversation, not a monologue. The heroes and villains we choose to remember reveal the values we hold dear and the ones we'd rather forget. So the next time you hear a story about a legend, ask yourself, who gets to decide which side of history they're on, and what happens when we dare to question that verdict? Unearthing these 45 lost legends wasn't as simple as flipping through history books. The process was more like piecing together a mosaic where half the tiles had been scattered or deliberately hidden. We started by diving into sources most mainstream histories ignore: fragmented merchant logs, disputed court chronicles, even folk songs passed down through generations. Think of it like detective work, where a single line in an ancient poem might be the only clue to a ruler's true legacy, or a faded mural in a ruined temple could reveal a healer's forgotten breakthroughs. The first filter was obscurity. These aren't figures who merely lack Wikipedia pages, they're ones whose footprints were nearly erased. Take the pirate admiral who commanded a fleet of outcasts to defend a coastal kingdom, only to vanish from royal records after a rival dynasty took power. Or the mathematician whose theories shaped early astronomy, yet whose name survives only as a scribble in the margin of someone else's manuscript. Their stories aren't just untold, they're often actively suppressed. But staying forgotten wasn't enough. Each figure had to have left a mark, however faint, on their world. A philosopher whose ideas quietly influenced a revolution centuries later. A diplomat who brokered peace between warring states, then was airbrushed out of victory celebrations. Influence wasn't always measured in battles won or laws passed. Sometimes it lingered in the whispers of oral traditions or in the stubborn survival of a single artifact. Then came the mystery. We prioritized figures shrouded in enigma, those with gaps in their stories that invite speculation. The warrior queen whose tomb has never been found. The inventor whose devices were so ahead of their time, later scholars assumed they must be myths. These aren't just gaps in knowledge, they're doorways into reimagining the past. Finally, diversity mattered not just in geography or era, but in the very definition of what makes a legend. Yes, there are conquerors and rebels here, but also a court jester whose satire toppled a regime, and a nun whose coded letters hid groundbreaking scientific observations. Legends aren't just made in battlefields or palaces, they're forged in kitchens, marketplaces, and the quiet corners where history rarely looks. This wasn't about creating a tidy list, it was about restoring voices that change how we see the past. Because every time we recover one of these stories, it's like adjusting a lens. Suddenly, the picture of history gets sharper, richer, and far more surprising than we were taught to believe. Deep in the mist-shrouded valleys of the Himalayas, where modern maps fade into legend, there once stood a kingdom that defied its era. Its ruler wasn't just a monarch, she was a force of intellect. Known to her people as the Scholar Queen, she wielded a quill as deftly as a scepter. While other rulers built armies, she constructed libraries. Her court wasn't filled with sycophants in silk, but with astronomers debating celestial patterns, physicians dissecting herbal remedies, and poets weaving epics in a dozen languages. This was no ordinary throne room, it was a crucible of ideas. Yet for all her brilliance, her kingdom's fate remains one of history's most tantalizing puzzles. The few surviving manuscripts rescued from crumbling monasteries or unearthed in buried chests paint a portrait of a realm abruptly severed. One season, her capital bustled with scholars trading scrolls from Baghdad to Beijing. The next, silence. Some blame the Mongols, their horsemen sweeping through mountain passes like a storm. Others point to the earth itself, a landslide sealing off vital trade routes, starving the kingdom of resources. But the most chilling theory whispers of sabotage. Rival rulers, threatened by her influence, may have orchestrated her downfall, burning libraries to ash and scattering her advisors to the winds. What makes her story so haunting isn't just the mystery of her kingdom's end, it's the fragility of progress itself. The Scholar Queen proved a society could thrive on curiosity rather than conquest. Her laws protected debate over dogma. She funded experiments centuries ahead of their time, from early vaccinations to hydraulic engineering, and then gone. Not with a slow decline, but as if someone had snuffed out a lantern mid-sentence. Perhaps that's why her fragments of poetry still resonate today. In one surviving verse, she writes of knowledge as a river that outlasts the stones trying to dam it. Even in ruin, her legacy lingers. Modern linguists still puzzle over the hybrid script she invented to unify her kingdom's dialects. Botanists rediscover plants described in her medicinal texts, their uses long forgotten. She reminds us that history isn't just about who won wars, but whose ideas refused to die even when their names were erased. So the next time you hear of a lost civilization, ask yourself, what brilliance might we have inherited if their lanterns hadn't been extinguished? And how many other scholar queens are still waiting to be found? The ocean has always been a place of lawlessness and opportunity, but few exploited both, quite like the man known only as the Viper of the Java Sea. While names like Blackbeard and Captain Kidd echo through history, his was deliberately scrubbed from official logs, not because he lacked infamy, but because his victories struck too deep at the pride of empires. Imagine a pirate so cunning, he didn't just raid ships, he outmaneuvered entire naval squadrons, turning their own tactics against them. His fleet, a motley assembly of stolen warships and repurposed fishing vessels, became the nightmare of every merchant sailing from India to China. What set the Viper apart wasn't just brutality, it was strategy. Where others sought gold, he targeted knowledge. His most infamous heist wasn't a chest of jewels, but a Dutch East India Company vessel carrying navigational charts. Overnight, he gained secrets that took Europe decades to map. With them, he ambushed supply convoys, sabotaged naval repairs, and vanished into uncharted coves like a specter. Rumors swirled that he'd built a hidden fortress, a labyrinth of caves where stolen wealth funded a rogue kingdom, but no empire could confirm its location because those who found it never returned. Yet here's the twist: in some coastal villages, he wasn't reviled as a monster, but celebrated as a folk hero. Tax records show towns under his protection paid far less to his fleet than they had to colonial tax collectors. Was he a thief or a resistance leader in pirate's garb? The Dutch branded him a terrorist, but his own crew, a mix of escaped slaves, disgraced scholars, and defected soldiers, swore loyalty to the death. Even his flag held a message, not the typical skull and crossbones, but a coiled serpent above an open book, a threat or a statement that knowledge was the deadliest weapon of all. The greatest mystery isn't where he buried his treasure, it's why history worked so hard to erase him. After a disastrous naval campaign failed to capture him, the Dutch scrubbed his name from reports, redacting even his defeats to avoid inspiring copycats. The British, humiliated by his seizure of a Royal Mail ship, pretended the incident never occurred. By the time he vanished, likely succumbing to betrayal or storm, his legend had already been dismantled, plank by plank. Today, fishermen near Sumatra still whisper about lights flickering in forbidden bays. Maybe it's just we'll owe the wisps over the water, or maybe the viper's greatest trick wasn't evasion, but making the world forget he existed at all. While empires rose and fell, one man walked the shadowed streets of a dying city, not with a sword, but with a satchel of herbs and a mind sharp enough to challenge death itself. History calls him the healer of the plague stricken, though his real name has been lost to time. Picture this: a pandemic so brutal it emptied entire neighborhoods. The air thick with the scent of burning tar and despair, physicians of the era clung to outdated theories, bleeding patients, applying leeches, blaming miasma. But this healer saw differently. Where others saw divine punishment, he saw patterns. He noticed that certain families, though living side by side, remained untouched. His breakthrough wasn't born in a grand university, but in the quiet observation of a widow's garden, where a humble weed brewed into tea seemed to shield her household from the sickness. His methods were revolutionary. He isolated the sick not to abandon them, but to protect the healthy, a radical idea at the time. He boiled cloths to sterilize them, prescribed garlic and honey for infections, even crafted early face coverings soaked in antiseptic resins. Survivors' accounts describe him moving through the chaos like a whisper, leaving bundles of herbs at doorsteps with instructions etched in charcoal. And it worked. Towns under his care saw death rates halved. Yet when the plague receded, the medical elite dismissed him as a superstitious herbalist. No guild would record his findings, no patron funded his work. Why? Because his success exposed their failures. The truth cuts deeper. Scrolls recently unearthed in a monastery cellar reveal that his treatments were systematically erased. A prominent physician of the time, whose own ineffective remedies had been funded by the crown, wrote privately of silencing the upstart before his heresy spreads. Modern scientists analyzing his recipes found compounds with real antimicrobial properties. That weed in the widow's garden, a potent source of salicylic acid, the foundation of aspirin. His sterilization techniques predated germ theory by centuries. Perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't that his name was forgotten. It's how many lives might have been saved if his knowledge hadn't been buried. Today, as researchers dust off ancient texts for clues to combat modern diseases, his story asks us an uncomfortable question: how many other healers, silenced by pride or politics, could have changed the course of medicine? And what cures might still be hiding in the fragments they left behind? Trust was the foundation of the Order of the Silver Shield, a brotherhood sworn to protect pilgrims and relics with their lives. Their halls echoed with vows of loyalty, their armor engraved with symbols of unity. Yet beneath that gleaming surface festered a betrayal so profound, it shattered the order like a hammer to glass. The man at the center of this rupture wasn't some invading warlord or jealous rival. He was one of their own, a high-ranking commander, once celebrated for his valor, who methodically unraveled the order from within. The clues are scattered like breadcrumbs across forbidden texts. A monk's diary hidden in a secret compartment speaks of the serpent among saints. A damaged fresco in a ruined chapel shows a knight's face scraped away, his armor defaced with tar, but the most damning evidence, the Order's own financial ledgers. In the years before their collapse, vast sums vanished, not stolen in raids, but diverted through perfectly legal channels. Grain stores meant for famine relief sold to mercenaries. Sacred relics lost during routine transfers. This wasn't impulsive theft, it was a slow, surgical dismantling. Why? That's where the mystery deepens. Some chroniclers claim he sought revenge for a buried scandal, perhaps a lover exiled or a kinsman denied burial rites. Others insist he was bribed by a rival kingdom, his loyalty bought with chests of gold. But the most chilling theory suggests ideological corruption. Fragmentary letters attributed to him speak of the Order as a rusted chain holding back progress. Did he see himself as a revolutionary, purging what he viewed as outdated ideals? Or was that just the lie he told himself to justify treachery? The aftermath was brutal. When the betrayal was finally uncovered, the Order's leaders acted with terrifying efficiency. Every record bearing his name was burned. His portrait was removed from the Great Hall, the space left conspicuously empty. Even the date of his expulsion was erased, as if by denying him a place in their history, they could undo the damage. But legends have a way of leaking through the cracks. In remote villages near the Order's old strongholds, mothers still warn children about the nameless knight who sold his soul. And in the ruins of their headquarters, archaeologists found one last clue, a single silver gauntlet, melted almost beyond recognition, buried beneath a collapsed wall. Was it hidden in shame, or placed there as a warning that even the brightest armor can hide the darkest hearts? Beneath the shifting sands of a forgotten desert lies the ghost of a structure so audacious, it defied the architectural limits of its age. Known only as the architect of the Crimson Spire, this master builder envisioned a monument not just to outlast stone, but to rewrite the skyline of human ambition. Travelers' journals from the 12th century speak of a tower that pierced the clouds like a spear of the gods, its surface clad in glazed tiles that caught the sunrise and set the horizon ablaze. Local legends claim its shadow could be seen from 3 days' ride away, a navigational landmark for caravans and a beacon for pilgrims. Yet today, not a single stone remains standing. The clues to its disappearance are as layered as the ruins themselves. One theory points to conquest. Invaders, recognizing the spire's symbolic power, may have toppled it not just to claim the land, but to break the spirit of its people. A fragmentary siege account describes fires so hot the very stones wept molten glass. But there's a darker possibility: systematic erasure. Tax records from a later dynasty show shipments of red stone, matching the spire's unique material, being hauled away to build palaces and fortresses elsewhere. The very grandeur that made it immortal might have sealed its fate, reduced to raw materials for rulers who feared its legacy. What makes this loss so haunting isn't just the scale of the spire, but the mind behind it. Recently discovered clay tablets reveal the architect's notes, calculations for wind resistance, diagrams of pulley systems to lift blocks weighing tons, even sketches of gardens designed to bloom at different heights, creating a living tapestry of color. This wasn't mere construction, it was poetry in stone, yet the tablets also hint at a struggle. One entry laments the shortness of days and the blindness of kings. Was the spire never completed? Did its creator live to see his vision compromised, or worse, repurposed as a quarry? Modern engineers who have studied the fragments are stunned. The spire's base was designed to sway slightly in earthquakes, a technique not rediscovered until the 20th century. Its ventilation system, channeling desert winds to cool interior chambers, predates Persian wind catchers by centuries. This wasn't just a building ahead of its time. It was a manifesto declaring what humanity could achieve when imagination outstripped convention. Perhaps that's why its absence lingers like a phantom limb. The Crimson Spire challenges our belief that greatness endures. We assume pyramids and cathedrals survive because they must, that their scale alone protects them. But history is littered with marvels that vanished because they were too beautiful, too innovative, or too threatening to the powers that followed. The spire's true lesson isn't about architecture. It's about fragility, that the grandest dreams can be undone not just by time or disaster, but by the petty needs of those who come after. So when you next marvel at an ancient wonder, ask yourself, how many others should have stood beside it, and what might we have learned from the ones we let slip away? Power rarely changes hands cleanly, but few transitions were as deliberately messy as the reign of the man history calls the usurper of the twin thrones. His rise reads like a masterclass in manipulation, not just overthrowing a ruler, but annihilating their very memory. Official portraits were scraped clean and repainted with his likeness. Court poets composed new verses praising his divine right, while the previous dynasty's ballads were burned in public squares. Even the dates on monuments were chiseled away and recarved to extend his lineage back generations. This wasn't just politics, it was historical identity theft on a staggering scale. What makes his case extraordinary isn't the violence of his coup, but the precision of his lies. Surviving tax records show entire villages renamed to honor his ancestors' who likely never existed. A recently unearthed stela, hidden beneath a temple floor, reveals the shocking truth. Its original text hails a queen's military victories, but the surface has been meticulously sanded down, replaced with a nearly identical inscription crediting those same battles to the usurper. The forgery is so skillful, it took modern laser scans to detect the tampering. Archaeologists now call this the palimpsest problem, layers of truth and fabrication pressed together like old parchment. Take the famous siege of Amber Hills. For centuries, chronicles described it as the usurper's defining triumph. But fragments of a soldier's diary, preserved in a sealed jar, tell a different story. The fortress gates were opened from within by defectors. No glorious assault, no brilliant strategy, just betrayal spun into propaganda. The most disturbing revelation came from a midden heap behind the royal kitchens. Among broken plates and animal bones, scholars found hundreds of seal fragments, the kind used to authenticate official documents. Each bore subtle variations, as if someone had been practicing replicating the old regime's insignia. This wasn't impulsive destruction, it was a bureaucratic campaign to rewrite reality itself, yet cracks remain. A child's slingshot pellet, etched with the name of the deposed prince, found lodged in a palace wall. A mourning poem scratched inside a well bucket. These tiny acts of defiance prove something vital. Even the most thorough erasure can't silence every voice. The usurper's greatest fear wasn't rebellion, it was memory. Because while you can burn records and shatter statues, you can't unmake the truth whispered in shadows. That's why archaeologists now sift through trash heaps and privy shafts, hunting for the stories he tried to bury. Because history isn't just written by the victors, it's preserved by the stubborn. Few names evoke the romance of exploration like Marco Polo or Magellan, but what if history's greatest cartographer wasn't celebrated in his own time, or even remembered at all? Meet the man we'll call the explorer of uncharted lands. Picture this, a lone figure trudging through monsoon-soaked jungles, bartering with merchants in bustling ports no European had ever seen, sketching coastlines so accurately, modern geographers gasp at their precision. His journals, crammed with notes on tidal patterns, medicinal plants, and even the migratory routes of rare birds, read like a love letter to the planet's hidden corners. Yet for centuries they gathered dust in the back of a Lisbon monastery, misfiled under ecclesiastical tax records. The real shock isn't just the breadth of his travels, it's what he witnessed. One crumbling page describes a city of canals where traders exchanged glass beads for spices, its towers decorated with intricate copper filigree. Archaeologists now believe this was the lost port of Suvarnadurga, swallowed by rising seas 500 years ago. Another passage details a medicinal tea used by highland tribes to cure fever, a recipe modern labs confirm contains potent antimalarial compounds. This wasn't just exploration, it was preservation. His ink captured worlds that would vanish within decades. So why was his work buried? The answer might lie in a marginal note by some long-dead bureaucrat of no strategic value. In an age when maps were state secrets, his accounts held no easy riches, no gold-laden temples or weak points for invasion. Worse, they contradicted colonial propaganda. His journals spoke of sophisticated societies with advanced astronomy and democratic councils, shattering the myth of savage lands awaiting conquest. When a rival explorer later plagiarized fragments of his work, he cherry-picked only the exotic beasts and primitive rituals, twisting observations into justification for empire. The bitter irony, the explorer's greatest contribution might have been his humility. Where others planted flags and claimed dominion, he recorded. Where conquerors saw resources to extract, he saw knowledge to exchange. In one telling entry, he writes of a coastal elder who taught him to navigate by jellyfish bioluminescence. The sea gives her secrets only to those who ask, never to those who demand. Perhaps that's why his maps were ignored. They weren't tools for possession, but invitations to wonder. Today, as researchers race to decode his fading ink, they're finding eerie echoes of our own world. His warnings about deforestation's impact on river systems, his notes on how overhunting disrupted entire ecosystems. The explorer didn't just chart space, he documented time, capturing civilizations at the precipice of change. His real legacy isn't the lands he walked, but the question he forces us to confront. How many truths have we buried because they didn't fit the story we wanted to tell? And what might we learn if we dared to unearth them? Power doesn't always sit on the throne. Sometimes it lurks in the shadows behind it. The figure known as the Shadow Chancellor was the epitome of this truth, a man who turned whispers into laws and rumors into royal decrees. For decades, he stood just outside the candlelight of court portraits, his face half turned from history. Official records list him as a mere advisor, but private correspondence tells a different story, letters between nobles fretting over his uncanny sway over the crown, merchants complaining of tariffs mysteriously altered after midnight meetings, even foreign ambassadors noting how monarchs would pause mid-sentence, glancing his way before answering pivotal questions. What made him so dangerous wasn't brute force, but something far subtler, the illusion of choice. He never issued commands, he planted seeds. A grieving queen might decide to execute a rival after he mused aloud about treasonous conspiracies. A young king, unsure of his own judgment, would voluntarily sign trade deals that conveniently enriched the chancellor's allies. His genius lay in making puppets believe they pulled their own strings. Yet his greatest trick was erasing his fingerprints from history itself. Tax rolls show vast estates purchased through intermediaries, their deeds leading back to shell owners. Diplomatic treaties bear monarch seals, but drafts in hidden archives reveal his edits' entire clauses were written in his distinctive, cramped script. The few surviving caricatures depict him with ink-stained fingers, a sly nod to his real weapon, the pen that outsliced the sword. Then came the fall. Unlike dramatic rebellions or bloody coups, his end was chillingly bureaucratic. One day, his name vanishes from council minutes. Servants' logs stop noting his arrivals. It's as if the court collectively decided to unremember him. The most telling clue, a single line in a disgraced scribe's diary. Today they told us never to speak of him again on pain of the tower. The mystery isn't just what he did, it's why his erasure was so total. Was it shame over how easily he'd manipulated the realm's most powerful, fear that his strategies might inspire copycats? Or something darker? Recently uncovered ciphers suggest he'd compiled dossiers on every noble's secrets, a web of blackmail so vast it could have toppled the kingdom. Maybe his silence wasn't punishment, but the last move in his game, ensuring no one could ever trace the rot back to its source. Today, historians piece together his legacy through absence, the gaps in records, the unusually large expenditures with no explanation, the way certain policies reversed overnight with no debate. He's a ghost in the machinery of power, proving that sometimes the most dangerous villains aren't the ones who break the rules, but those who learn to bend them so deftly, the world never notices until it's too late. In a world where philosophy was the domain of privileged men debating in marble halls, one voice shattered the mold, a woman whose ideas were so revolutionary, they sparked not just debate but panic. She didn't just question the status quo, she dismantled it brick by brick, arguing that wisdom wasn't inherited through bloodlines or bought with gold, but earned through curiosity and shared freely. Her name has been erased from official records, but those who risked everything to preserve her work called her the philosopher of the banned school. Imagine teaching so dangerous, possessing even a single page could get you exiled, or worse. Her core philosophy was radical in its simplicity. Knowledge belongs to no one, and therefore to everyone. In an era when literacy was a weapon of the elite, she opened secret schools in cellars and barns, teaching farmers to read using carved fruit peels as letters. Her most infamous text, The Mirror of Chains, argued that social hierarchies weren't natural laws, but inventions, cages built with words, then polished until they shine like destiny. Passages describe how the wealthy claimed divine right while quietly fearing the day the oppressed learned to read their own chains. Authorities moved swiftly to silence her. Scrolls were burned in the town square. Followers were publicly branded with ink dipped in pepper, a cruel mockery of their love of learning, yet her ideas refused to die. Fragments of her work survived as merchants wrapping paper, quilt linings, even hidden beneath layers of paint in religious icons. One recently discovered manuscript was sewn into the sole of a child's shoe, its words pressed against generations of footsteps, a metaphor she'd have cherished. What's chilling isn't just the suppression, but what it reveals about power's fragility. Her critics didn't burn her books because they were weak. They burned them because her ideas were strong. Consider this: her theories on education predated modern pedagogy by centuries. She wrote that children learn best through play, that curiosity flourishes where fear retreats. Had her schools survived, might literacy have spread faster? Could entire movements for equality have ignited earlier? The most poignant discovery came in 2018, when a clay cup from a dig site revealed writing etched along its base, a toast from her followers. to the books they burn and the minds they'll never reach. That's the real tragedy here. We'll never know how many breakthroughs were lost in those fires, how many voices were never given the tools to speak. But every time a child asks why, with defiance instead of fear, her legacy flickers back to life. The philosopher didn't just teach ideas, she planted embers. And history has proven, again and again, how long embers can smolder before they blaze. War has always been a profitable business, but few turned bloodshed into an empire as ruthlessly as the shadowy figure known only as the Merchant of War. While kings and generals clashed on battlefields, he operated in the backrooms of history, a ghost who armed both sides of every conflict, then vanished before the bodies were counted. Imagine a man so untraceable, not even his own couriers knew his face. Contracts were sealed with wax but no signature. Gold changed hands in unmarked chests delivered to neutral ports. And the weapons, always just outdated enough to ensure armies needed constant resupply, but never so primitive they'd seek other dealers. The scale of his operation only came to light centuries later, when a flood in Antwerp's warehouse district exposed a trove of waterlogged ledgers. These weren't ordinary account books, they were blueprints for chaos. One page might list 50 cannons shipped to a rebellion in Naples, while the facing page noted identical artillery sold to the besieged garrison there. Dates proved he'd timed deliveries so neither side gained decisive advantage, prolonging conflicts like a gambler rigging a roulette wheel. Even more chilling were the marginal notes. Client A requests famine prices for grain oblige. Client B's rivals must not receive the new flintlocks until spring. This wasn't commerce, it was societal engineering through scarcity and blood. What set him apart from common profiteers was his mastery of deception. Modern forensic accountants tracing his network found a labyrinth of false fronts: a silk trader in Lyon who never sold silk, a spice merchant in Alexandria with no spices, all funneling arms through legal loopholes. His greatest innovation, the triple invoice, one copy for customs declaring harmless goods like pottery, a second, hidden version detailing real cargo for trusted captains, and a third, fictitious manifest to mislead competitors. By the time authorities deciphered one layer, the trail had gone cold. Yet the biggest mystery isn't how he operated, it's why he stopped. No death record surfaces, no triumphant arrest, just silence. Some speculate he retired under a new identity, perhaps as one of those wealthy merchant princes who suddenly appeared in distant courts, their past suspiciously blank. Others whisper of a grimmer fate, that a coalition of his own clients, finally realizing they'd been played, hired assassins to end the game, the most haunting theory. He didn't vanish at all, that his network simply evolved, its methods refined by successors who learned from his genius. After all, war never really goes out of style, it just changes suppliers. Perhaps that's why his ledgers still unsettle historians today. They don't just reveal one man's greed, they expose the uncomfortable truth that violence is a market like any other, thriving on demand and manipulation. The Merchant of War didn't create conflicts, he simply recognized humanity's oldest product and sold it back to us at a premium. And somewhere, in some form, that trade continues. The faces change, the methods adapt, but the ledger, it never really closes. Amid the smoke and chaos of a city under siege, one man moved like a shadow through back alleys and secret passages, not carrying gold or weapons, but armfuls of parchment and scrolls. This was the guardian of ancient knowledge, a scholar turned smuggler who risked everything to save the written word from annihilation. While conquerors celebrated their victories by burning libraries, those great storehouses of human thought, he staged quiet rescues under cover of darkness. Picture him stuffing texts into hollowed-out bread loaves, sewing maps into the linings of refugee children's coats, even burying clay tablets beneath olive trees with nothing but a knotted rope to mark the spot. His mission wasn't just to hide books, it was to outlast the storm of ignorance. The brilliance of his strategy lay in its simplicity. Instead of hoarding treasures in one vulnerable vault, he scattered them like seeds across the countryside. A farmer might find a sealed jar of medical texts beneath his sheep pen. A wine merchant could unwittingly transport poetry inside hollowed-out barrels. Even now, discoveries still surface, like the 2018 excavation of a monastery cellar that revealed a false wall packed with astronomical treatises, their margins crammed with notes in the Guardian's distinctive hand. Archaeologists wept when they unrolled them. These weren't just preserved works, but living documents where he'd cross-referenced star charts with sailors' logs, updating ancient knowledge with contemporary wisdom. Yet his greatest legacy might be what's still missing. Records suggest he safeguarded over 10,000 scrolls, but only a third have been recovered. Some could be waiting beneath the floorboards of abandoned villages or sealed inside forgotten wells. Others may have traveled farther than anyone imagined, traded along spice routes to distant lands where their origins were lost. Imagine stumbling upon a Sanskrit translation of a Greek play in a Nepalese temple, or finding fragments of an Egyptian chemistry manual woven into a Tibetan prayer flag. The Guardian didn't just save knowledge, he set it adrift on the winds of time, trusting that the right minds would find it when the world was ready. What makes his story so urgent today is the fragile nature of truth itself. In an age where information can vanish with a keystroke, his methods seem almost prophetic. He understood that survival sometimes requires dispersal, that the best way to protect light isn't to shield a single candle, but to spread countless sparks where no storm can extinguish them all. So the next time you read an ancient text that survived against impossible odds, pause and listen closely. Between the lines, you might hear the faintest whisper of gratitude, from the past to the man who refused to let it die. The most dangerous lies aren't the ones we question, they're the ones we desperately want to believe. That's how the man history calls the false prophet wielded his terrible power. He didn't just preach, he weaponized hope itself, twisting faith into a noose for thousands. Picture a charismatic figure standing atop a crumbling temple, his robes fluttering as he promised salvation from drought and famine. His voice didn't just soothe, it hypnotized. Followers abandoned homes, burned crops, even severed ties with family members who doubted, all for a paradise that existed only in his words. What made his deception so potent wasn't just grand spectacle, but psychological precision. He mastered the illusion of exclusivity, whispering to followers that they alone were chosen, special souls who'd survived the coming cataclysm. Survivors' scrolls describe how he'd isolate dissenters, then stage miracles to reinforce his divinity, a drought-breaking rain timed to his prayers. A follower's sudden healing after days of staged illness. These weren't random tricks, they were calculated reinforcements, conditioning loyalty like a puppeteer tightening strings. The darkest insight comes from a recovered ledger hidden beneath floorboards in a ruined compound. In crude shorthand, it outlines his tactics. Day 17, starvation weakens resistance. Day 29, sleep deprivation opens minds to visions. This was manipulation as science. He weaponized basic needs: hunger, fatigue, loneliness, until rational thought eroded. Followers weren't just deceived, they were systematically broken down and rebuilt in his image. Yet the most chilling detail isn't how they followed, it's how they fought to stay. When authorities finally intervened, accounts describe devotees clinging to his robes, begging for the privilege to die for his cause. Even after exposure, some refused to believe, scattering into the wilderness to await his promised return. That's the true horror of the false prophet's legacy. He proved how easily light can be bent into a weapon, how the human hunger for meaning can be exploited until it devours itself. Today, archaeologists sifting through the ruins of his compound find disturbing echoes. Children's toys arranged in ritual patterns, kitchenware etched with symbols of impending doom. These weren't the traces of a madman's rantings, but of ordinary lives slowly warped by calculated fear and manufactured ecstasy. His story isn't just a warning about one man's evil, it's a mirror held up to our own vulnerabilities. Because the line between faith and fanaticism isn't drawn by prophets, it's drawn by the choices we make when someone offers us heaven in exchange for our humanity. They tried to silence her with fire and prison walls, but words have a way of sneaking through the cracks. The rebel poet didn't just write verses, she crafted weapons disguised as beauty. Picture a moonlit courtyard where a weaver hums while her loom clicks, the tune carrying lyrics that would get her whipped if authorities recognized them. Or a tavern where drunkards slurred revolutionary stanzas into their ale, laughing as guards dismissed them as nonsense. Her genius wasn't just in what she wrote, but how she made it stick, turning oppression into rhythm, grief into melody, so her words clung to memory like burrs to a traveler's cloak. The secret lay in her mastery of duality. On the surface, her poems celebrated harvests and first loves, safe topics for censors, but layered beneath were metaphors that burned. A description of a caged nightingale became a cry against tyranny. A lullaby about a river's journey whispered coded instructions for rebel rendezvous. Scholars now call this the honeycomb technique, sweetness to lure the ear with fire hidden in the hive. When officials finally caught on and burned every printed copy they found, it was too late. The verses had already slipped into the wild, adapted by bards and beggars until they became part of the land's very breath. What's miraculous isn't just their survival, but their transformation. A love poem scribbled on a prison wall might surface decades later as a drinking song in a distant port, its refrain slightly altered but its heart intact. Recently discovered fragments from a midwife's diary reveal how she taught birthing mothers the poet's lines as pain mantras, each gasp of labor keeping the rebellion alive. Even nature played its part. Archaeologists found her most subversive stanza carved into the bark of an ancient oak, the tree's growth rings proving it predated the crackdown by years. The real irony, the censor's brutality only amplified her reach. Every public book burning became a perverse advertisement, driving more people to memorize what they couldn't possess. When officials banned gatherings, her verses migrated to bedtime stories and fishing chants. By the time scholars began reconstructing her original texts from 100 scattered sources, they realized the truth. The poet had engineered her own immortality. She didn't just write poems, she turned her people into living libraries. Today, linguists tracing the evolution of her words across dialects have made an eerie discovery. Certain phrases appear in protest signs half a world away, though the connection was lost long ago. That's the power of a true rebel, not just to defy tyranny in her own time, but to plant seeds that bloom in soil she'd never see. So the next time you hear a folk song that gives you chills, listen closer. The past has ways of singing itself back to life when we least expect it. Some killers crave attention, carving their names into history with blood and bravado. But the most terrifying are those who leave no name at all, just a string of corpses and unanswered questions. Meet the enigma we'll call the silent assassin, a ghost who moved through palaces and parliaments like a draft through a cracked window. His signature wasn't a blade left in the ribs or a vial of poison on the bedside table, it was the eerie absence of evidence. No frantic guards, no witnesses with stories too wild to believe, just powerful men and women found cold in their beds, their deaths officially blamed on apoplexy, bad oysters, or the vague, sudden illness scribbled in court physicians' logs. The first clue he existed at all came centuries later, when a historian cross-referencing mortality records noticed an impossible pattern. Between 1582 and 1591, 9 key political figures across 3 rival kingdoms died within weeks of blocking the same trade agreement. All were healthy, all opposed the deal, and all perished with symptoms matching a rare tropical venom, one that leaves no trace after 6 hours. Coincidence? Unlikely, especially when diplomats' letters surfaced complaining of a shadow that stifles dissent before it speaks. What made him so effective was his patience. Unlike theatrical poisoners who worked in dramatic banquets, he preferred the quiet hours. A nursemaid might recall a servant delivering medicinal tea that wasn't ordered. A stable boy could swear he saw a figure slip through the garden gate, but never convincingly enough to raise alarms. By the time anyone suspected foul play, the trail was colder than the corpse. The real mystery isn't his methods, it's his allegiance. Some scholars argue he was a freelancer, selling his services to the highest bidder. A fragmentary ledger from a Venetian spy master lists payments to the Quiet One alongside sums that could buy a small duchy. But others point to the targets, always men and women obstructing specific policies, never random nobles. Was he the blade of a secret consortium, a radical faction's answer to backroom deals? Perhaps the most chilling theory comes from a coded letter buried in a Spanish bishop's tomb. It warns of an instrument that thinks for itself and cuts strings not meant to be severed. Could the silent assassin have been playing his own game, eliminating not just for pay, but to shape empires to some private design? We'll never know for certain. Like smoke through a keyhole, he left only enough trace to haunt us with possibilities, proof that sometimes the deadliest villains aren't those who shout their wrath, but those who let history itself muffle their footsteps. Genius often arrives too early, bearing gifts the world isn't ready to unwrap. Such was the fate of the man we'll call the inventor ahead of his time, a visionary whose workshop brimmed with contraptions that defied the limits of his age. Picture a cluttered atoll, where brass gears gleamed like stolen sunlight, where scribbled diagrams hinted at flying machines and self-propelled carriages centuries before the world caught up. His peers called him a madman, patrons dismissed his prototypes as carnival tricks, and by the time historians pieced together the truth, his name had crumbled into the footnotes of forgotten patents. The tragedy lies not in his failures, but in how close he came to changing everything. Take his most infamous device, a mechanical loom that could weave intricate patterns without human guidance. When demonstrated to textile guilds, masters scoffed at the clattering contraption, insisting hands could never be replaced. Yet buried in his notes was a breakthrough we'd now recognize as early programming, punch cards dictating patterns, a concept that wouldn't resurface for generations. Even more astonishing, his designs for a water-lifting engine using spiral pumps, a system so efficient, modern engineers reconstructed it in 2012 to irrigate arid fields in Pakistan. The blueprints had been gathering dust in a Florentine archive for 400 years. Why did his brilliance vanish into obscurity? The answer is equal parts envy and economics. Guild records reveal a coordinated campaign to discredit him. Rivals spread rumors his devices were powered by occult forces. Wealthy patrons invested in manual labor, quietly pressured lenders to deny him funds. But the most damning evidence comes from a recently discovered diary of a competitor. Convinced the Duke his wheel would put millers to starvation, better to bury one man's fancy than risk 10,000's bread. Progress wasn't just ignored, it was actively suppressed to protect the status quo. The bitter irony, many revolutionary inventions of later eras bear eerie resemblance to his sketches. A 19th century patent for a steam-powered boat mirrors his paddle wheel designs. An early 20th century new gear system matches his calculations exactly. Historians now suspect some later inventors may have stumbled upon his scattered papers, consciously or unconsciously replicating his work without crediting the source. It's as if his ideas were seeds scattered to the wind, sprouting in distant gardens where no one remembered who'd first held them. Perhaps the most poignant discovery came from an unlikely place, the margins of a child's notebook found in his former home. Amid doodles of dragons and ships, the young apprentice had scribbled, "Master says the future weighs too much for one man to carry." That's the real tragedy of the inventor ahead of his time. He didn't lack vision, he lacked allies. His world wasn't ready to lift the weight of tomorrow, but his story forces us to ask, how many other geniuses have we left straining under that burden? And what might we achieve if we finally learned to share the load? Justice wasn't blind in his courtroom, it was gagged and bound, sold to the highest bidder. The man we now call the judge who sold justice didn't merely interpret the law. He auctioned it, turning his bench into a marketplace where lives were traded like livestock. Imagine a verdict scrawled not in ink but in the blood of innocence. Each guilty ruling sealed with a handshake in shadowed alleys, each acquittal weighed against bags of silver. For decades, his gavel fell like an executioner's axe, yet the records show only pristine proceedings, the truth buried beneath layers of forged documents and terrified silence. His methods were as meticulous as they were monstrous. Court transcripts reveal eerie patterns: wealthy defendants miraculously acquitted of identical charges that condemned poorer men to hang. A merchant's son might walk free after a drunken brawl left a laborer dead, while a starving farmer swung for stealing a loaf of bread. The real horror wasn't just the bribes, it was the theater. Witnesses coached to perjury, evidence lost by guards who later prospered. Even the courtroom's architecture played its part. A hidden side door let wealthy accused slip away unseen, while the poor were paraded through jeering crowds. The breaking point came when a clerk, sickened by what he'd witnessed, smuggled out a ledger. Its pages read like a ledger of damnation, names of the condemned beside payments received, each entry coded as judicial expenses. But the cover-up that followed was almost as chilling as the crimes. Rather than a public trial, the judge was quietly pensioned off, his cases reviewed by the same colleagues who'd benefited from his corruption. Official histories declared his court a model of efficiency. The few who dared question were reminded how dangerous it was to undermine public trust in the law. Yet fragments of truth persist. A widow's petition, buried in an unrelated property dispute, describes how her husband's last words named the judge's price. A ballad sung by street children, later banned, mocked the hanging judge who wore gold beneath his robes. Most haunting of all are the empty spaces in prison logs, where entire pages were razored out, leaving only ghostly traces of ink where names once stood. What makes his legacy so corrosive isn't just the lives destroyed, it's how thoroughly the system protected itself. By erasing his crimes, they made every honest verdict suspect. When justice becomes a commodity, even the innocent must wonder, was their freedom earned or merely purchased by someone wealthier? That's the real sentence he passed, not on the condemned, but on the very idea of fairness. And unlike his victims, that wound still hasn't stopped bleeding. History loves the thunder of war drums, but what about those rare souls who fought battles without drawing a sword? The diplomat who prevented war was one such figure, a man whose words carried more weight than any army. Picture this: two empires teetering on the brink of annihilation, their borders bristling with troops, their kings exchanging threats like poisoned daggers. Enter an envoy with no crown, no legion, just a parchment and an uncanny ability to see the future neither side dared to imagine. A future where both could walk away without burning the world to ashes. The secret to his success wasn't just eloquence, it was psychological mastery. While other negotiators flattered or threatened, he listened, really listened. A recently discovered journal from his assistant describes how he'd spend hours studying cultural taboos, childhood folktales, even the favorite wines of each ruler's court. Why? Because he understood that peace isn't brokered in grand halls, it's woven from tiny, almost invisible threads of trust. When talks stalled, he'd reference an obscure proverb from the opposing king's homeland, or arrange a chance meeting with a beloved royal tutor. These weren't tricks, they were lifelines thrown across a chasm of mutual fear. The treaty he crafted was a work of art in compromise. Instead of humiliating concessions, it offered face-saving ambiguities, phrases like mutual understanding, where others demanded unconditional surrender. Trade routes were subtly rerouted to benefit both sides. Prisoners were exchanged not as spoils, but as guests returning home. Even the signing ceremony was staged at a neutral temple said to be sacred to both cultures. Every clause was a mirror reflecting back each empire's deepest desire to look strong while stepping back from the abyss. So why did history forget him? The answer lies in what came next. Within a generation, chroniclers reduced his triumph to a footnote, glorifying instead the generals who'd clamored for war. Paintings depicted the peace as divine intervention, not human ingenuity. Why? Because victory in battle fits neatly into sagas' heroes and villains, flags planted in bloodied soil. But peace, it's messy. It requires admitting that sometimes the greatest strength is choosing not to strike. The most damning evidence of his erasure came in 2019, when archivists found the original treaty buried beneath later revisions. His seal had been pried off, his name scratched from the preamble, yet in the margins some stubborn scribe had penned, "Remember the man who made the sword stay sheathed." That's the tragic irony. The diplomat's greatest achievement was making catastrophe seem so inevitable. His prevention of it felt like mere luck, but luck doesn't draft treaties that last centuries. Luck doesn't calm the tempers of tyrants. Perhaps his true legacy is the question haunting us today. Why do we still build statues to those who wage wars, but rarely to those who stop them? And what might our world look like if we celebrated the architects of peace as loudly as the architects of victory? The most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who brandish knives in alleyways, they're the ones who never need to. The puppet master of crime was a phantom in the underworld's shadows, a man who turned vice into an empire without ever dirtying his own hands. Picture a web so vast, its strands connected pickpockets in Paris to opium dens in Shanghai, all answering to the same invisible pull. His genius wasn't in force, but in leverage. A smuggler might wake to find his child's toy left on the pillow, a silent reminder that resistance was futile. A corrupt official would receive ledger pages proving his embezzlement, accompanied by a single gold coin, payment for compliance. This wasn't just intimidation, it was psychological theater, each act designed to make his victims imprison themselves. The few who dared cross him learned the hard way that the puppet master's vengeance was swift and untraceable. A ship carrying a disloyal crew would sink in calm waters, its cargo mysteriously salvaged weeks later by a rival gang. A gossipy courtesan might vanish mid-performance, her body found years later in a sealed cellar. Posed as if asleep, a rose clutched in her hands. Authorities chalked it up to underworld rivalries, never suspecting a single mind orchestrated every accident. Even his enforcers didn't know his face. Commands came through children's rhymes, tavern songs, or the arrangement of fruit in a market stall. Then came the letter, discovered wedged behind a loose brick in a Marseille brothel. Its contents were so explosive, the magistrate who read it burned it immediately. Only his scribe's hurried notes survive. He walks among us as a gentleman, the orphanage, his first canvas, the scar not on skin but in the glass. Cryptic as it was, the clue hints at a truth more unsettling than any bandit king, that the puppet master wasn't some back alley brute, but a figure of standing. Perhaps a philanthropist funding the very asylums that housed his victims' families, or a magistrate who presided over the trials of his own operatives, smiling as he passed sentence. What chills the bones isn't just the scale of his operations, but the way he weaponized society's trust. The orphan who grew up to be his blade, the priest who delivered his threats as confessionals. Even now, historians sifting through old trial records find eerie patterns, witnesses recounting identically worded testimony, judges ruling with unusual leniency on certain cases. Like a stain seeping through parchment, his influence warped the system itself, and then nothing, no dramatic arrest, no body in a ditch, just silence, as if he'd stepped into a shadow and willed it to swallow him whole. Some say he retired to some sun-drenched villa, counting coins and chuckling at the chaos he'd sown. Others whisper he's still out there, his methods refined by time, pulling strings in a world that never learned to look for the hand behind the puppet. One thing's certain, the scariest monsters aren't the ones that lurk in the dark. They're the ones who taught us to love the light, so we'd never think to check who's holding the candle. She never held a crown or commanded armies, yet her defiance shook empires in ways swords never could. The Feminist Pioneer lived in an age where a woman's worth was measured by her silence, but she wielded ink and ideas like weapons, carving spaces for brilliance where none were permitted. Imagine a woman gathering girls in secret courtyards, teaching them to read beneath the pretense of embroidery lessons, stitching letters into the fabric of their minds. While official histories recorded kings and conquests, her revolution unfolded in whispers, a single candle passed hand to hand in the dark. What made her dangerous wasn't just the schools she founded, but the heresy she taught, that a woman's mind was no less capable than a man's. Fragments of her students' diaries, hidden for centuries in attic trunks and monastery vaults, tell the real story. One entry describes how she dissected philosophy texts with teenage girls, challenging them to debate unladylike topics like justice and governance. Another recounts her marching pupils to a local printing press, demanding they set type for their own essays, a brazen act when most women weren't allowed to touch books. Her curriculum was a quiet rebellion, mathematics to unravel patriarchal lies, science to question dogma, rhetoric to arm her students against dismissal. The backlash was inevitable. Authorities labeled her gatherings hysteria circles, claiming educated women would birth deformed children. A nobleman's ledger lists payments to men who dissuaded the mad schoolmistress through vandalism and threats. Yet the most damning evidence of her impact comes from the gaps in records themselves. A census from her town shows an anomalous spike in female literacy rates, followed by a later page where the ink bleeds suspiciously, as if someone had tried to scrub away the data. Even her name vanishes from tax rolls mid-career, replaced by the vague notation, widow's stipend, though no marriage record exists. Why does her erasure matter now? Because it reveals how progress isn't just suppressed, it's gaslighted. Generations grew up believing women of that era didn't want education, when in truth they were systemically denied it. The pioneer's story forces us to ask, How many other dissenting voices were scrubbed from history until their struggles seemed implausible? The answer lingers in the margins. A merchant's furious letter complaining of unruly daughters quoting that witch's nonsense. A playwright's satire mocking bluestockings who dared cite legal precedents. These weren't just insults, they were proof her ideas spread despite the clampdown. The most poignant discovery came in 2021, when conservators restoring a mural uncovered a hidden layer. Beneath a painted saint's robe were the faint outlines of a woman holding a book, surrounded by smaller female figures. Infrared scans confirmed the original artist had depicted the pioneer's classroom, only to whitewash it under pressure. Yet the paint couldn't fully hide what lingered beneath. Like her legacy, the truth had a way of seeping back to the surface. Today, as historians piece together her syllabus from dog-eared notebooks and oral traditions, her real triumph becomes clear. She didn't just teach subjects. She taught women to recognize their own erasure, and in doing so, made it impossible to complete. Charisma can be a weapon sharper than any blade, and few wielded it as lethally as the man known as the cult leader who brainwashed a town. He didn't storm gates or raise armies, he invaded minds. Picture a quiet village where neighbors once gathered for harvest festivals, now boarding up windows and whispering about divine judgment. Where children played in sunlit squares, now chanting hymns penned by their new prophet. His power wasn't in miracles but in manipulation, a slow, methodical rewiring of reality itself. The first trick, love bombing. Survivor accounts describe how he'd shower recruits with attention, remembering birthdays, praising their hidden talents, offering the warmth starved souls crave. Then came the isolation. Families were urged to cut ties with toxic outsiders, even reporting relatives who questioned the group. Meetings stretched late into the night, not for worship, but exhaustion, a tactic to break critical thinking through sleep deprivation. Former members recalled how he'd invent enemies, sometimes the government, sometimes rival sects, always something to keep fear simmering, but his masterstroke was language control. He replaced common phrases with coded terms. Doubt became weakness, questions were poison. Soon, followers policed their own thoughts, terrified of slipping into sinful independence. A recovered diary from a teenage member reads like a hostage's plea. Today I almost asked about mother, stopped myself before the word left my lips. The shepherd says memory is the devil's hook. The tragedy unfolded in stages. First, the town's crops were left to rot as labor shifted to building his temple. Then medicine was banned as lack of faith. By the time authorities intervened, malnutrition and untreated illness had taken dozens. Yet the cover-up that followed was almost as chilling. Official reports blamed collective hysteria, downplaying his role. Witnesses were pressured into silence. One survivor's letter was confiscated for disturbing the peace. Modern psychologists analyzing his methods spot textbook techniques: gaslighting, thought-stopping, the gradual escalation from devotion to dependence. But what unsettles experts most isn't the psychology, it's how easily it worked. His followers weren't gullible fools, they were teachers, blacksmiths, mothers. People like us, that's the real warning whispered by this tragedy, that the line between faith and fanaticism isn't marked by intelligence or strength, but by the universal human hunger to belong. And sometimes the most dangerous predators don't lurk in shadows, they stand in the light, offering exactly what we ache to hear. Centuries before the word ecosystem entered our vocabulary, one man stood atop a windswept cliff, watching the slow death of his homeland, not from war or plague, but from humanity's own recklessness. The Environmentalist of Antiquity was no wild-eyed prophet. He was a scholar, a farmer, perhaps even a former logger who'd seen too many ancient trees fall. His warnings weren't carved in temple stone or preserved in royal decrees. They were scribbled on the backs of tax receipts and whispered in village squares, urgent messages bottled in the indifference of his age. What made his insights so extraordinary was their precision. Surviving fragments of his writings don't just lament deforestation, they detail the domino effect. Cut the pines on the ridges, one passage reads, and the rains will scrub the soil into the valleys, choking the rivers that feed our fields. Another describes how stripping coastal mangroves led to fish vanishing from nets within 3 years. This wasn't vague doom-mongering, it was clinical observation, a ledger of cause and effect kept by a man who understood nature's balance long before ecology became a science. The tragedy, his pleas were met with laughter. Merchants dismissed him as a crank, their ledgers fat with timber profits. Rulers sneered that the land was endless, its bounty inexhaustible. A recently unearthed play from the era even satirizes him as a wool-clad fool who fears shadows and squirrels, but time proved him right in the cruelest way. Soil cores from his region show a sudden spike in sediment layers around the period he predicted, evidence of catastrophic erosion. Pollen records reveal entire species of plants disappearing within decades, followed by the animal populations that depended on them. His homeland didn't just decline, it unraveled. Modern climatologists poring over his notes are stunned by their accuracy. One passage warning that the winds will grow hungrier aligns perfectly with sediment studies showing increased dust storms after deforestation. His description of springs drying up matches hydrological models of aquifer collapse. The most haunting discovery, a list of species he'd observed dwindling, each one confirmed by fossil records to have vanished locally within 50 years of his death. This wasn't guesswork, it was the first documented case of a human predicting ecological collapse from observable patterns. Yet his real lesson isn't about trees or soil, it's about the cost of ignoring inconvenient truths. The same scrolls that mock him also revealed desperate edicts from later rulers, fines for cutting young trees, rewards for terracing hillsides, too little, too late. By then, the environmentalist's homeland was importing grain it once exported, its rivers running brown with the very earth that had once made it rich. His story forces us to ask, how many warnings are we dismissing today because they demand hard choices? And when the next scholar stands atop a cliff counting the losses, will we listen, or will we too wait until the rivers choke and the winds grow hungry? He built hospitals with hands that had once shackled children, and donated libraries paid for with the screams of mothers torn from their sons. The slave trader turned philanthropist was a master of moral laundering, a man who calculated that stone monuments would outlast memory, that gold plaques could gild over bloodstains. Public squares still bear his name, chiseled in marble beside words like benefactor and visionary. But peel back the veneer and you'll find ledgers listing human cargo alongside bolts of silk and barrels of molasses. A receipt for 12 strong males tucked between invoices for stained glass and pipe organs. The dissonance is staggering. In H.I.'s Chinese letter, that carefully curated final act, he commissioned portraits of himself handing alms to the poor, while locked chests in his estate held letters bargaining for fresh shipments from coastal forts. One such note, discovered behind a loosened brick in his country home, coldly instructs agents to prioritize adolescents between 10 and 14 years as they withstand the crossing better. Yet that same year, his donations funded an orphanage where a bronze bust still greets visitors with a beatific smile. What makes his hypocrisy so insidious isn't just the scale, it's the strategy. He didn't merely buy absolution, he weaponized generosity. By endowing churches, he secured sermons praising his piety. By financing schools, he groomed generations to recite his virtues while curricula omitted his crimes. Even his will was a masterpiece of misdirection, leaving fortunes to uplift the unfortunate without acknowledging he'd created the misfortune. The darkest revelation came when archivists cross-referenced his charity ledgers with slave ship manifests. Dates aligned with chilling precision, a hospital wing groundbreaking weeks after a vessel docked with livestock listed as its cargo. The math was grotesquely simple. Every ward, every scholarship, every marble fountain represented a precise exchange rate of human suffering converted into social capital. Yet the true villainy lies in how successfully he rewrote his ending. Modern tours at his grand estate mention trade enterprises but never chains. Restoration efforts preserve his donated art while boxing up plantation records as niche archives. Even well-meaning docents parrot the myth of redemption, that his philanthropy somehow balanced the scales. But redemption isn't transactional. You can't purchase innocence with stained glass any more than a murderer can atone by donating the murder weapon. Perhaps the most damning epitaph comes from an anonymous graffito scratched into the base of his statue decades ago. You weighed souls against stone and forgot stone crumbles. Today, as activists demand contextual plaques and schools reconsider his name, his legacy faces the reckoning he evaded in life. Because history isn't just written by the victors, it's corrected by the descendants of those they tried to erase. History remembers the warriors who charge into battle, but rarely the ghosts who move through the shadows, the ones who win wars before the first shot is fired. The spy who saved a nation wasn't just a master of disguise, he was a sculptor of fate, bending history's trajectory with nothing but a stolen document or a whispered warning. Picture a man with a dozen faces, slipping through candlelit taverns and royal courts alike, his real name known only to the handlers who burned his files. While kings took credit for peace treaties and generals boasted of bloodless victories, he was the reason those victories were possible, a silent architect of stability in an age of chaos. His most stunning feat wasn't just uncovering plots, it was threading the needle between exposure and annihilation. Take the infamous Candlelight Conspiracy, where a cabal of nobles planned to assassinate a visiting emperor and pin the blame on their own king. The spy didn't simply intercept their letters, he let them believe their scheme was advancing, all while feeding them false intelligence that led them to incriminate themselves. The night before the assassination, their hideout was raided not by the king's guards, but by the emperor's own retinue, who found damning evidence planted just conspicuously enough. The result: averted war, disgraced traitors, and zero suspicion that the throne had ever been warned. What made him extraordinary wasn't just his skill, but his ethics. Declassified files reveal a man who refused to kill unless absolutely necessary, preferring to manipulate enemies into neutralizing themselves. A rival agent's diary discovered in a Vienna attic describes being captured by him, only to be released days later with a forged pardon and a new identity under one condition: desert the profession forever. He spoke of loyalty not to crowns but to lives. The entry reads, "I thought it madness, now I think it mercy." Yet the greatest testament to his success is how thoroughly he was erased. Unlike celebrated spies of fiction, his existence wasn't just secret, it was systematically unpersoned. Payroll records list him only as Agent 12, with payments routed through a labyrinth of front charities. Even his death is a riddle. One report claims he fell defending a safe house, while another suggests he simply walked into a foggy street one evening and never emerged. The most plausible theory: he staged his own disappearance when age made him a liability, slipping into the anonymity he'd perfected. Today, historians piecing together his legacy face a paradox. The very secrecy that made him effective now obscures his impact. We'll never know how many wars he prevented, how many massacres he diverted, but perhaps that's the point. His monument isn't stone or statue, but the unbroken peace treaties and the children who grew up never knowing how close their world came to collapsing. Because the best spies don't just vanish from records, they vanish from the need for them. Immortality wasn't just a dream for the Mad Alchemist, it was an obsession that burned through every shred of his humanity. Hidden beneath a crumbling estate, his laboratory wasn't filled with the usual glass vials and leather-bound tomes. Instead, the walls were lined with iron restraints, the floors stained with substances no one dared identify. His experiments weren't confined to animal trials or herbal tinctures. Prisoners snatched from dungeons, beggars lured with promises of coin, even political dissidents pardoned into his custody. They all vanished into his chambers, where the line between science and nightmare blurred beyond recognition. The few fragmentary notes that survived tell a story of escalating horror. Early entries detail attempts to distill life essence from rare minerals and plants, written in meticulous, almost reverent script. But as the pages progress, the handwriting fractures into frantic scrawls. One passage describes grafting animal glands onto human subjects. Another boasts of a serum that slowed aging in rats, though the footnote adds, Subject 7 convulsed for 18 hours before expiration. The most chilling discovery, a ledger listing names crossed out in batches, each accompanied by a single word, insufficient. Rumors of his success persist because of what investigators found in the lab's deepest chamber. A single cell lined with lead, its door sealed from the inside. Inside, no body, just a set of manacles snapped clean through, a pile of dust that glinted oddly under lamplight, and a final note etched into the stone wall: the flesh fails. The mind persists. Was it a confession of failure or a triumphant boast? Local legends claim a figure matching his description was glimpsed decades later in a distant city, his face eerily unaged but his eyes black as a starless sky. What chills the bones isn't just the cruelty, but the logic behind it. The Mad Alchemist treated human lives like expendable reagents in a formula, each death just another variable adjusted. Modern ethicists dissecting his notes find eerie parallels to contemporary debates. How far is too far when chasing breakthroughs? His legacy lingers not in some elixir of eternal life, but in the warning etched by one of his few surviving assistants. He forgot that to conquer death, you must first deserve to live. A child's footprints in the mud fading as the rain falls. That's how his story began. The boy who'd become the Refugee General didn't cross borders with fanfare or paperwork. He crawled under thorn bushes while smoke stained the horizon behind him, clutching a dagger too heavy for his hands and the muffled sobs of a sister he'd never see again. Years later, when court historians painted his triumphs on palace walls, they gave him a noble birth in some far-off land. A convenient lie to explain his strange accent and the scars that mapped a journey no one wanted to remember. His rise was as improbable as it was relentless. Enlisted as a stable boy in a foreign army, he learned tactics by eavesdropping on officers, practicing maneuvers with stolen chess pieces in the hayloft. What set him apart wasn't just skill, it was desperation. While native-born soldiers grumbled about rations, he fought like every battle was his last chance to belong. A surviving drillmaster's journal notes his uncanny instinct for terrain, likely honed fleeing through forests as a child. By 25, he'd risen to captaincy not through patronage, but by single-handedly holding a bridge during a retreat, buying time for thousands to escape, an act that earned him a medal and a carefully crafted new ancestry. The erasure was systematic. Census records show his birthplace altered from disputed territories to northern provinces. A wedding contract lists his father as a fictitious merchant rather than the farmer executed in the war. Even his battle scars were repurposed into propaganda. The lash marks from a refugee camp became dueling wounds from a noble youth. The truth survived only in whispers. The cook who recognized the way he seasoned stews from a homeland now erased from maps. The aging sergeant who'd been there when a starved teenager stumbled into their camp. Yet his loyalty to his adopted nation was no performance. When rebellion erupted in the borderlands, his ancestral homeland, he crushed it without hesitation. Letters to his wife reveal the cost. "I dream in a tongue my children will never speak." That's the cruel paradox of his legacy. The very traits that made him invaluable, his outsider's perspective, his hunger to prove himself, were the ones his superiors scrubbed from history. They needed his brilliance, but not the truth that forged it. Modern archaeologists recently uncovered a curious artifact near his final battlefield, a child's wooden toy, hidden in the lining of his ceremonial armor. No royal chronicle mentions it, no portrait shows him holding it, but the carving matches folk art from a valley whose name no longer appears on maps. Perhaps that's the real monument to the Refugee General, not the statues in conquerors' plazas, but the silent things he carried, proof that some roots run deeper than empires dare admit. Faith is a fragile thing, easily shattered, even more easily exploited. The forger of relics understood this better than anyone, turning devotion into a lucrative trade with the steady hands of a master artisan. Picture a dim workshop where candlelight flickered across vials of aged pigments and slabs of marble dust. Here, he didn't just craft objects, he manufactured miracles. A sliver of wood became a fragment of the true cross after careful staining and strategic carving. A rusted nail, buried in dung to accelerate corrosion, emerged weeks later as a holy relic from a saint's martyrdom. His genius wasn't in artistry alone, but in psychology. He knew pilgrims didn't just want relics, they needed to believe in them. The scheme was devilishly simple. Targeting wealthy travelers on sacred routes, he'd plant rumors of rediscovered treasures through a network of whisperers, a tavern keeper's casual mention of a vision, a beggar's tale of a long-lost crypt. By the time the relic surfaced, demand had already been stoked. His most infamous creation, a phial of St. Lucia's tears, supposedly wept during her execution. The liquid was little more than resin and rosewater, but when held to sunlight, it shimmered with flecks of ground glass to mimic divine radiance. Wealthy matrons and desperate invalids paid fortunes for a single drop. Then came the slip. A visiting scholar, examining a batch of relics for a noble patron, noticed something odd. The iron in a medieval martyr's chain had traces of smelting techniques not invented until centuries later. The forgery was exposed not by faith but by metallurgy. Ledgers seized from his estate revealed the staggering scale. Over 600 fake relics circulating across 3 kingdoms, each accompanied by forged certificates of authenticity. The real shock was the buyers, not just gullible peasants, but bishops and princes who displayed his handiwork in cathedral altars. What makes his story so unsettling isn't the deception itself, but what it reveals about the machinery of belief. The forger didn't create demand, he merely fed it. In an age where relics were political tools, proof of divine favor for rulers, magnets for pilgrimage gold, his fakery flourished because the powerful needed it to. When authorities finally dragged him from his silk-draped mansion, they found half-finished commissions for noble clients who'd clearly known the truth. The real scandal wasn't the forger's greed, but the collective willingness to look away. Yet the darkest twist lies in the aftermath. While the forger rotted in a dungeon, most of his relics remained enshrined. To admit they were fakes would undermine the faith. and the fortunes they'd built, so the lie became truth by consensus. Even today, some still venerate his handiwork, proving his greatest forgery wasn't the relics themselves, but the illusion that faith and fraud could never share the same altar. While kings commissioned victory scrolls and poets sang of conquests, one man bent over candlelit parchment with a different mission: to give voice to the voiceless. The Chronicler of the vanquished didn't just document battles. He recorded the choked sobs of mothers identifying bodies in the mud, the whispered prayers of farmers watching their crops burn, the unbroken dignity of leaders forced to kneel. His quill was a lifeline thrown across time, ensuring that defeat wouldn't mean erasure. What made his work so radical wasn't just its content, it was its clandestine nature. Official archives celebrated the triumphant march of empires, but his manuscripts were buried in clay jars, sewn into the linings of refugee cloaks, or tucked behind monastery altars. One surviving leaf, carbon dated to the aftermath of a famously brutal siege, lists names in meticulous columns, not soldiers, but bakers, midwives, and children. Beneath each name, a single line: remember how they lived, not just how they died. Historians now recognize these as casualty lists from the losing side, preserving identities that victors had reduced to numbers. The Chronicler's greatest act of defiance was his insistence on nuance. Where court historians painted the conquered as faceless barbarians, his accounts revealed their humanity. A prince's diary, salvaged from a sacked library, describes enemy generals sharing medical knowledge with their captors. A merchant's ledger, annotated in the chronicler's hand, notes how occupying soldiers bartered fairly with locals until orders from distant capitals turned them cruel. These weren't just details, they were landmines under the official narrative, proof that history's monsters were often ordinary people caught in the gears of power. Yet preservation came at a cost. Fragments show evidence of frantic edits, passages scratched out and rewritten in cipher, suggesting he was hunted. One water-stained page bears a bloodied fingerprint beside the words, "If found, burn this." But remember, scholars now believe he was part of a network: monks who smuggled his scrolls in hollowed-out reliquaries, widows who recited his words as lullabies to keep them alive. The miracle isn't that some survived, but that any did at all. Modern discoveries continue to rewrite our understanding. In 2019, a diver retrieving Roman-era shipwreck artifacts found a lead case containing 7 perfectly preserved pages. They chronicle not a battle, but its aftermath: the conquering army's shock at finding enemy trenches filled with handwritten verses, their dying poets still clutching ink-stained style. This was the chronicler's true gift, forcing even victors to confront what they'd destroyed. His legacy whispers a warning we still struggle to hear: that every history told by a single side is half a lie, and every silenced story leaves the world poorer for its absence. Fear wasn't just a tool for the tyrant's executioner. It was an art form, each scream composed like a symphony of suffering. While most executioners simply carried out sentences, this man engineered them, transforming pain into public theater with devices that blurred the line between punishment and performance. Imagine a marketplace where the usual chatter of merchants stilled as crowds gathered not just to witness justice, but to marvel at the grotesque ingenuity of his creations. A wheel that rotated just slowly enough to prolong agony, a cage suspended high above the square, its occupant exposed to scorching sun by day and bone-chilling cold by night, a living lesson in the cost of defiance. What set him apart wasn't the brutality, it was the chilling theatricality. Records salvaged from a collapsed dungeon archive describe how he'd stage morality plays, where victims reenacted their supposed crimes before punishment, turning confessions into macabre entertainment. One fragmentary scroll details a device called the liar's lyre, which forced a blasphemer's fingers to pluck its strings as flames licked at their feet, a twisted metaphor made flesh. Even more disturbing were his improvements on existing tools. The common stocks became the people's pillory, where passers-by were encouraged to add their own petty torments, turning civic punishment into communal cruelty. Yet the darkest revelation came centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered his personal workshop. Beneath rusted blades and corroded chains lay meticulously kept notebooks. These weren't just inventories of pain. They were design journals, complete with sketches and annotations debating the efficiency of various angles for flaying knives or the optimal weight for crushing presses. One entry chillingly notes, subjects expire too quickly in current configuration. Adjust breastplate spikes to 1.5 inches for prolonged vitality during demonstrations. This wasn't a man merely doing his job. This was a craftsman obsessing over his medium. The irony of his downfall, those same devices meant to cement his infamy became the instruments of his erasure. When the tyrant fell, the new regime needed to distance itself from the old horrors, but the tools were too useful to discard, so they were rebranded, their origins scrubbed clean. The liar's lyre became the heretic's harp, attributed to an anonymous medieval inventor. The notebooks were burned, save for a single page used to convict him at his own trial, where he reportedly laughed as judges described his methods in vivid detail. What lingers isn't just the horror of his work, but the uncomfortable truth it reveals about collective guilt. The crowds who cheered his spectacles later claimed they'd been coerced. The artisans who forged his devices insisted they were just following orders. Even history, in erasing his name, performed its own kind of absolution. Yet in quiet corners, whispers survived. Midwives told cautionary tales of the silent smith who built machines that wept. Drunkards in dockside taverns muttered about a man who could make stone scream. The most haunting discovery came in 2017, when conservators restoring a medieval church fresco found a hidden layer beneath the paint. The original artwork depicted not saints, but a row of faces contorted in agony, each bearing unmistakable similarities to the executioner's documented victims. Some unknown artist had risked everything to ensure these screams would outlast the silence imposed upon them. It's a fitting epitaph for the tyrant's executioner, that his greatest fear wasn't death but being forgotten. And in the end, even his erasure became proof of his enduring presence, a shadow still flinching at the edges of history's light. She spent her nights not in a grand observatory, but crouched on a windswept rooftop, her fingers raw from etching coordinates onto wax tablets by the faint glow of an oil lamp. The astronomer who mapped the stars had no polished brass telescopes or royal patronage, just a homemade quadrant carved from scrap wood, and an unshakable conviction that the heavens spoke to those who listened. While scholars debated celestial spheres in cushioned halls, she tracked comets through cracked roof tiles, recording their paths with such precision that 7 centuries later, NASA would use her data to pinpoint the exact week a dying star flared into history. Her breakthrough came from patience, not privilege. While male astronomers relied on second-hand observations from assistants, she charted every flicker herself, enduring frostbite and sleeplessness to log minute shifts in the night sky. One surviving notebook details how she calibrated her instruments by aligning them with a particular chimney across town, a humble landmark that became the anchor for measurements accurate to within 0.03 degrees. That meticulousness led to her crowning achievement, documenting the sudden appearance of what she called the guest star, a brilliant point in Cassiopeia that burned for 18 months before vanishing. Modern astrophysicists now recognize it as SN 1181, one of fewer than 10 historical supernovae visible to the naked eye. Her notes on its position and fading intensity remain vital references for studying stellar evolution. Yet the moment her work gained recognition, it was stolen. A prominent court astronomer who'd once dismissed her as a woman counting candles published a star catalogue bearing uncanny similarities to her charts, down to the same distinctive notations for variable stars. The only difference, her name appeared nowhere in its pages. Worse still, he weaponized institutional bias, convincing the Academy that no uneducated woman could produce such advanced calculations. Her protests were buried beneath layers of bureaucratic disdain. A single surviving letter to a sister reveals her fury. "They take the fruit of my labor and call it wild seed." The injustice cuts deeper when you realize how much was lost. Fragments of her later work, preserved in a merchant's scrapbook, suggest she'd begun theorizing about cosmic distances by tracking meteor showers, a concept Europeans wouldn't formalize for another 400 years. Had she been credited, might astronomy have leaped forward generations earlier? We'll never know. But there's poetic justice in the way modern science has posthumously restored her legacy. When the Hubble Space Telescope needed historical data to study SN 1181 remnant, it was her coordinates they trusted. Her chimney-aligned measurements still hold up under laser analysis. And in 2022, a team at Cambridge finally matched the plagiarized catalogue to her original notebooks using ink analysis and watermark dating. Perhaps her true monument isn't just in the stars she mapped, but in the cracks she exposed, the way a woman with no formal training, working in obscurity, could see further than the entitled men who claimed her vision as their own. The next time you look up at Cassiopeia, remember that constellation's brilliance isn't just celestial. It's the lingering glow of a mind too brilliant to be contained, even by the darkness of her time. The grandest deceptions often begin with the smallest details. A perfectly forged seal here, an impeccably tailored coat there. The con artist who swindled a kingdom didn't just impersonate nobility, he became it, down to the way he absent-mindedly tapped a signet ring against his wineglass, as if bored by his own inherited wealth. For 3 years, he moved through royal courts like a ghost in broad daylight, his true identity buried beneath layers of fabricated lineage and borrowed prestige. The genius of his scheme wasn't in its boldness, but in its patience. While other frauds grabbed purses and ran, he siphoned an empire's wealth, one carefully doctored invoice at a time. It started with a crisis, as the best cons often do. When a border conflict disrupted supply lines, he arrived, coincidentally, with a solution: a network of fictitious merchants supposedly loyal to his family for generations. Treasury records show how he inflated prices gradually, first by 10%, then 30%, then double, each increase justified by fabricated bandit raids or storms. The brilliance was in the paperwork. His ledgers were masterpieces of plausible fiction, complete with wax-sealed testimonials from imaginary mayors and notarized casualty lists. By the time auditors grew suspicious, he'd already diverted enough gold to buy a small nation, all while hosting lavish banquets to celebrate his patriotic sacrifices. The unraveling came from an unexpected source: a lowly clerk who noticed the same smudge on 3 different merchant seals. Under interrogation, the ink confessed what the conspirators wouldn't. Each stamp shared an identical flaw, like a painter accidentally signing their forgery. By then, the con artist had already staged his dramatic demise, a hunting accident with no body, just a blood-stained cloak and a conveniently grief-stricken cousin to identify the remains. Investigators later found his estate stripped bare, the furniture hollowed out to hide bullion, even the portrait frames lined with stolen bonds. Yet the true damage wasn't just financial. His greatest theft was trust itself. After his exposure, legitimate merchants faced paralyzing scrutiny, their goods rotting in warehouses as officials questioned every seal. The kingdom's economy never fully recovered, not because the gold was gone, but because the machinery of commerce had been poisoned by doubt. Even today, historians debate his most audacious trick, whether he truly vanished or simply reinvented himself elsewhere, leaving behind not just an empty treasury, but a lingering question: how many other noble benefactors throughout history were wolves wearing the same expertly tailored sheep's clothing? His blade never drew blood, yet his legacy cut deeper than any weapon. The pacifist warrior stood apart in an age where martial prowess was measured in corpses, a master of combat who saw each fight as a failure of diplomacy, each death as an irreversible tragedy. While rival schools boasted of lethal techniques, he perfected the art of rendering opponents helpless without permanent harm, a strike to pressure points that numbed limbs, a throw that pinned adversaries without bruising. Even his signature move, dubbed the Mercy Hold, was designed to immobilize attackers just long enough for reason to override rage. What made his approach revolutionary wasn't just technique, but intention. Surviving training scrolls reveal meticulous diagrams of human anatomy, not to identify killing blows, but to map pathways of minimal harm. A warrior's true skill, one fragment reads, lies not in how many he can slay, but how many he can spare. This philosophy drew scorn from traditionalists who called his methods the coward's way, until a legendary duel silenced them. Facing a champion who'd slain dozens in single combat, the pacifist warrior emerged victorious after 3 hours of evasion and precise counterstrikes, leaving his opponent physically unharmed but spiritually humbled, forced to acknowledge defeat without the stain of blood on either's hands. Yet history's greatest irony is how thoroughly his compassion was erased. As his influence spread through underground dojos and rebel factions, powerful warlords systematically scrubbed his name from records, fearing his ideology more than his swordplay. A censored manual from the era shows his techniques preserved, but attributed to an anonymous master. Even today, many martial arts lineages teach his disarming maneuvers without knowing their origin, the philosophy behind them diluted into vague platitudes about control. Rediscovered letters hint at the cost of his principles. They call me naive for believing a single life spared can ripple across generations, he wrote to a disciple. But when I see a former enemy kneel to mend a child's broken toy, I know my victories outnumber any conquerors. That quiet radicalism, the idea that mercy could be a martial art, may explain why authorities worked so hard to bury his legacy. Because the pacifist warrior proved a terrifying truth, that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a blade at the throat, but the refusal to use it. War thrives on chaos, but some weapons cut deeper than swords, not by spilling blood, but by corrupting the very elements that sustain life. The poisoner of wells was one such figure, a shadow who turned water into venom during a desperate siege. While history remembers conquerors who scaled walls and broke gates, this nameless saboteur waged a quieter, more insidious war, one measured in fevered whimpers and the slow, agonizing collapse of a city's strength. His crime wasn't just the act itself, but the violation of an unspoken wartime code, that even enemies deserved clean water to drink. The siege in question had already dragged on for months, with defenders holding out behind towering stone walls. Then, almost overnight, the stronghold's resilience crumbled not from breached defenses, but from within. Chroniclers describe a sudden wave of violent illness sweeping through the population. Soldiers retched in the streets, children spiked fevers that turned their skin ashen. The city's healers, overwhelmed, scribbled frantic notes about symptoms that defied all remedies: convulsions, blindness, a creeping paralysis that began in the fingers and spread inward. At first, they blamed spoiled rations or divine punishment, but when scouts reported enemy troops conspicuously avoiding the central wells, the grim truth emerged. Someone had poisoned the water. Forensic historians studying the event have pieced together the likely method. The saboteur or saboteurs would have needed intimate knowledge of the city's underground aqueducts and cisterns. Under cover of darkness, they likely slipped past sentries to dump toxins into the water network. The choice of poison remains debated. Some accounts point to hemlock or belladonna, plants notorious for causing delirium and death. Others suggest a more grotesque approach: rotting animal carcasses left to fester in reservoirs, breeding disease alongside poison. The result was the same: a populace too weak to hold swords, let alone defend ramparts. What makes this act so chilling isn't just its brutality, but its legacy. The poisoner's tactics crossed a line that even medieval warriors hesitated to breach. Ancient codes of combat, from the chivalric traditions of Europe to the Bushido of Japan, implicitly recognized certain boundaries: harming non-combatants, desecrating religious sites, and yes, poisoning water were considered dishonorable. After this siege, accounts from both sides express a shared revulsion. The attacking army, though victorious, reportedly executed their own scouts on suspicion of carrying out the act without orders. The surviving defenders, in rare agreement with their enemies, burned the contaminated wells rather than risk the poison lingering. Yet the mystery endures. Who was he? A disgraced alchemist hired for his knowledge of toxins, a turncoat within the city's ranks, bitter over some personal slight. The few surviving military scrolls from the era refer only to the deed of the Nameless One, as if even naming him might grant his cruelty immortality. Modern archaeologists searching the siege site have found tantalizing clues: a set of lockpicks buried near an old well shaft, a merchant's ledger noting a suspicious sale of nightshade and wolfsbane to an unnamed buyer weeks before the attack. But the poisoner himself remains a ghost, his identity as dissolved as the toxins he poured into history's darkest currents. Perhaps the most haunting lesson lies in the aftermath. The siege didn't end with a triumphant occupation, but with both sides abandoning the city victors and vanquished alike fleeing the specter of tainted earth. For years afterward, travelers avoided the area, whispering that the land itself had turned vengeful. Even now, the event lingers as a cautionary tale, a reminder that some weapons don't just kill people, they kill trust, dignity, and the fragile rules that keep war from sliding into outright savagery. The poisoner of wells didn't just claim lives, he proved how easily the bonds of shared humanity could be dissolved, drop by calculated drop. Words were his weapons, and with them he disarmed generations of hatred. The linguist who united tribes didn't just study language, he rewrote destiny with it, transforming the snarled dialects of warring clans into a bridge of shared understanding. Picture a man crouched by campfires in a dozen hostile territories, his notebook filling not with battle strategies, but with painstaking lists of how each tribe named the same stream, the same star, the same sorrow. His genius wasn't in imposing a new tongue, but in weaving a tapestry from the threads already there, a common language built from the overlooked overlaps between enemies. The dictionary he left behind tells only half the story. Its pages bulge with meticulous entries, true, but between the lines you can almost hear the arguments he soothed, the glares he softened. Take the word for home. One tribe spat it like a curse when referring to their rivals' villages. Another whispered it with grief for land stolen generations back. His breakthrough came when he uncovered an ancient lullaby shared by both groups, its lyrics using the term for hearthplace. That fragile fragment became the cornerstone of his lingua franca, proof that beneath the bloodshed, memory still bound them. Of course, peacemakers rarely get statues. Records from the era credit tribal elders with the ceasefire, barely mentioning the linguist's years of mediation. A surviving letter from a regional governor dismisses him as that scribbler of words, ignoring how those very words had cooled tempers at critical negotiations. Even his dictionary was later repurposed. Colonial scholars whitewashed its origins, framing it as a tool for administration rather than reconciliation. Yet traces of his impact linger where you'd least expect. Modern linguists studying the region's dialects found eerie consistencies in how insults are structured, as if the worst curses were deliberately made to sound clumsy in the shared tongue, discouraging their use. Folk tales from previously enemy villages now feature identical proverbs about the fool who speaks only to wound. Most telling, the way elders still hush quarreling children with phrases from his dictionary, their cadence unchanged across centuries. The real tragedy isn't that history forgot him, it's that we lost his methods. In an age where division thrives, his approach holds urgent lessons. He didn't erase differences or demand surrender of identity. He simply illuminated the hidden intersections where connection could begin. That's why archaeologists still pore over his water-stained notebooks, hoping to decode not just a language, but the radical idea that sometimes the path to peace isn't through force or fear, but through the quiet alchemy of a well-chosen word. Flames don't just burn parchment, they erase the future. The arsonist of a great library wasn't some wild-eyed fanatic wielding a torch in the night. He was a scholar turned saboteur, a man who knew exactly which shelves held the most dangerous ideas. Imagine standing in that vaulted hall as smoke curled around treatises on medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, each scroll a world about to vanish. His wasn't the rage of ignorance, it was the cold calculus of someone who understood knowledge's power and feared what might happen if it fell into the wrong hands. The tragedy cuts deeper when you realize what was at stake. Surviving catalogues list titles like The Mirror of Infinity, a Persian mathematician's exploration of fractal geometry, or The Song of the Tides, a coastal civilization's study of lunar cycles and agriculture. These weren't just books, they were threads in a vast tapestry of human understanding. The arsonist didn't just destroy objects, he severed connections between disciplines, leaving gaps we still stumble over today. Modern researchers examining the charred edges of rescued fragments have found marginal notes referencing lost works like a star map pointing to constellations that no longer exist. What drove such calculated destruction? Clues hide in a half-melted seal discovered in the ruins, a symbol linked to a radical sect that believed knowledge should be purified for moral safety. Their doctrine held that certain ideas were too dangerous for the masses. Anatomy texts might undermine faith in the soul, political theories could incite rebellion, alchemical studies might fall into reckless hands. The arsonist saw himself as a surgeon, cutting away humanity's corrupt intellect to save it from itself. Yet his greatest crime was the silence left behind. We'll never know how many breakthroughs were delayed because a key insight turned to ash. That medical treatise on sterilization techniques might have saved millions from plague. The engineering manual describing windmill pumps could have prevented famines. Even the act of destruction carried its own irony. The arsonist used an incendiary recipe from a chemistry text he'd later burn, proving knowledge could neither be contained nor controlled. The few surviving scraps tell a haunting story. One scrap bears the words, "To know is to question," its edges blackened where the sentence continues into oblivion. Another shows a star chart with a single notation. This pattern repeats in the smallest shell and the largest galaxy. These fragments are like footprints in ash, proof of voices we'll never fully hear. Perhaps the cruelest twist is how thoroughly the arsonist failed. By trying to erase ideas, he immortalized them. The very act of destruction became a cautionary tale about the fragility of truth. Today, digital archivists work to scatter copies of vulnerable texts across servers worldwide, ensuring no single flame can ever wipe humanity's slate clean again. The library's ghosts whisper a warning. Ideas don't die when they're burned, they just wait for someone to strike a new spark. He moved through a world that refused to accommodate him, a world of staircases where there should have been ramps, of doors too narrow for his wheelchair, of public spaces designed as if people like him didn't exist. But where others saw barriers, the disability rights advocate saw blueprints for change. Long before accessibility was codified into law, he sketched solutions in the margins of his notebooks, lever-style handles that could be operated with one's elbow or chin, adjustable height counters that served both standing and seated users, even early prototypes of curb cuts that would later transform city streets. His designs weren't just functional, they were elegant, proving that inclusivity could coexist with beauty. The bitter irony, his breakthroughs were systematically stolen. A recently uncovered correspondence between two architects casually references that cripple's silly ramp idea before detailing how they'd repackaged it as their own innovative slope feature for a prestigious commission. Worse still, medical journals of the era dismissed his ergonomic tools as special accommodations rather than universal improvements until able-bodied inventors rebranded them as conveniences for the masses. The angled knife he devised for arthritic hands became a chef's precision tool. The voice-activated lamp he built for those with limited mobility was patented decades later as a smart home luxury. Time and again, his pragmatism was erased, his genius reduced to footnotes in other people's success stories. What makes his erasure so galling isn't just the credit stolen, it's the lives impacted by the delay. Consider the ripple effect of a single stolen idea. His plans for accessible public transit, buried in a city planner's drawer for 30 years, meant generations of disabled citizens were effectively imprisoned in their homes. A ledger from a tool manufacturer reveals how executives deliberately shelved his adaptive gardening implements, fearing they'd confuse the market, until a competitor's nearly identical design won awards years later. The human cost is measured in the indignities endured. The students denied education, the workers barred from employment, the artists whose talents never reached the public, all because the world refused to acknowledge the architect of accessibility was himself disabled. Yet fragments of his legacy persist in unexpected places. A church basement in Leipzig holds a chair modified with his distinctive clamp system, its original inventor long forgotten by congregants who still benefit from it. A faded poster in a Parisian print shop depicts one of his inclusive playground designs credited only to Anonymous. Most telling, modern disability activists tracing the origins of universal design keep stumbling upon his unpatented sketches, realizing with growing fury how many modern solutions predate their supposed inventors by half a century. Perhaps the greatest testament to his vision lies in what happened when his ideas finally broke through. Those curb cuts he championed, they now benefit parents with strollers, travelers with rolling luggage, cyclists, and delivery workers. His wide doorways accommodate not just wheelchairs, but movers hauling furniture and friends walking side by side. The advocate understood a truth society is only beginning to grasp, that designing for disability doesn't narrow functionality, it expands it for everyone. His real crime, in the eyes of those who erased him, was proving that exclusion isn't just cruel, it's bad design, and bad design as his stolen sketches whisper from the margins of history is a choice we don't have to keep making. History loves a bold adventurer, but what happens when the adventure is pure fiction? The fraudulent explorer didn't just exaggerate his travels, he conjured entire continents from ink and ego, weaving elaborate lies that shaped maps and policies for decades. Picture this, a charismatic figure standing before rapt audiences, unfurling hand-drawn charts of undiscovered lands teeming with mythical beasts and golden cities. His journals, filled with vivid encounters and first contact ceremonies, earned him royal patronage and textbook immortality, except none of it happened. The rivers he described flowed only on paper. The mountains he claimed to scale existed solely in his imagination, and the people he supposedly met, they'd been thriving in those unknown territories for centuries. The depth of his deceit only became clear when linguists compared his accounts with indigenous oral histories, where he wrote of savage tribes performing human sacrifice. Local elders spoke of peaceful trade networks disrupted by his violent entourage. His dramatic tales of forging alliances with isolated kingdoms crumbled when archaeologists found records of prior European visitors, merchants and missionaries who documented the same communities generations earlier. Even his discovery of a strategic mountain pass was debunked by fur trappers' diaries referencing the route decades before his birth. What makes his fraud so insidious isn't just the stolen credit, it's the damage those lies inflicted. Colonial powers used his fabricated maps to justify land grabs, citing uninhabited regions that were actually bustling cultural centers. Natural resources he claimed to have found were already being sustainably harvested by local populations until his reports triggered exploitative rushes. Worst of all, his sensationalized depictions of indigenous peoples as primitive or hostile became entrenched stereotypes, fueling generations of discrimination. The most galling twist, his plagiarism wasn't even clever. Recently uncovered drafts show he copied entire passages from genuine explorers' memoirs, simply replacing place names and adding monster sightings. A side-by-side analysis reveals verbatim descriptions of flora and fauna, except where the original noted a common deer. His version featured a 12-horned devil beast. These weren't honest mistakes, they were deliberate myth-making designed to outshine dull truths with sensational lies. Yet the bitterest irony lies in how stubbornly his legacy endured. Even after exposure, geographic societies refused to revise maps, fearing embarrassment. Schoolbooks kept teaching his discoveries well into the 20th century because rewriting history felt more costly than perpetuating it. Only now are we unraveling the full cost, not just of his deception, but of our willingness to believe it, because the fraudulent explorer's greatest trick wasn't fooling his contemporaries. It was convincing generations that glory belongs to those who shout loudest, even when the land itself whispers otherwise. Truth came at a brutal price in the temple precincts of ancient Mesopotamia, where one man dared to lift the veil on sacred corruption. The Whistleblower of Antiquity wasn't some disgruntled clerk. He was a high-ranking scribe, privy to the innermost financial dealings of a cult that controlled vast grain stores and precious metal offerings. His moment of reckoning came when he noticed discrepancies in the harvest records. Entire wagonloads of barley vanished between the fields and the storehouses, while silver meant for widows' rations lined the pockets of priests who wore golden amulets beneath their linen vestments. What made his defiance extraordinary was its precision. Instead of railing in the streets, he compiled evidence with scribble rigor, clay tablets documenting diverted shipments, duplicate receipts exposing forged seals, even witness testimonies from farmers pressured into silence. The most damning record, a ledger hidden beneath the flooring of his home comparing official temple inventories with actual yields. The margins held chilling notes, third month, missing 300 measures. High Priest's nephew seen with new lapis bracelet. This wasn't just theft, it was systemic sacrilege, a betrayal of the divine trust that bound society together. When he finally presented his findings to the city elders, the backlash was swift and vicious. Temple authorities didn't deny the accusations, they reframed them. The missing grain became offerings to avert plague. The silver was recast as divine tribute, and the whistleblower, a troublemaker suffering visions, his records dismissed as the ramblings of a man cursed by the gods. Overnight, his name was scraped from public monuments. His family was barred from the marketplace. Even his signature administrative style, a distinctive way of pressing cuneiform wedges, was erased from official documents as if he'd never existed. Yet his exile couldn't extinguish the spark he'd ignited. Fragments of his scrolls resurfaced generations later during temple renovations, hidden in the walls like seeds waiting for spring. The reforms they inspired were gradual but profound. Term limits for priests, public audits of offerings, even the first known conflict of interest laws prohibiting temple officials from trading in commodities they oversaw. Archaeologists tracing these changes found something poignant, the whistleblower's distinctive wedge marks reappearing in later legal codes, anonymous but unmistakable. The cruelest twist lies in how modern his struggle feels. A merchant's letter from the era complains about the scribe who made honest theft impossible, echoing contemporary disdain for accountability. Even the methods used to discredit him, gaslighting, professional isolation, character assassination, mirror modern retaliation against truth-tellers. His story forces us to confront an uncomfortable pattern, that the machinery of silencing dissent hasn't evolved much in 3,000 years. Perhaps his true legacy lingers in the cracks between tablets, in the way sunlight still catches the edges of those ancient wedge marks, defiantly legible despite every effort to bury them. Because while empires can banish individuals, they can't unwrite the truth, not when it's baked into clay, and certainly not when it's etched into the collective memory of those who remember what was almost lost. The harbor was thick with smoke the night the slaver's ship supposedly burned, the screams of his crew echoing across the docks as witnesses swore they saw him leap into the inferno rather than face the mob waiting ashore. His enemies celebrated justice served in the most poetic way, a tyrant consumed by the very flames he'd used to intimidate others, but the truth was far colder. The man who'd built an empire on shackles and suffering hadn't embraced death, he'd engineered it. Forensic accountants studying his records centuries later noticed the discrepancies. The ship's manifest listed twice the usual provisions for a short coastal journey. A payment to a notorious forger appeared in his ledgers weeks before the tragedy. Most damning, the bodies recovered from the wreckage didn't match his crew's descriptions, missing the telltale scars and dental work documented in their indenturement contracts. This wasn't an accident, it was a stage play with expendable actors and a script written in blood. Where did he vanish to? Fragments of a merchant's diary found in a Lisbon archive describe a pale stranger arriving in a remote Azorean port around that time. His hands too soft for a fisherman, but his eyes sharp as a ledger keeper's. Local census records show a sudden spike in enslaved laborers at a secluded vineyard owned by a reclusive nobleman, a property later abandoned with its account books scrubbed clean. The timeline fits, the cruelty fits, even the geography fits. Those islands were a perfect crossroads for someone who knew how to move people invisibly across borders. But the most chilling clue emerged in 2019. when DNA tests on remains exhumed from an unmarked grave near that vineyard matched descendants of his victims. The bones showed signs of sustained malnutrition and restraint marks consistent with his known methods. He hadn't just escaped, he'd resumed his trade under the fog of anonymity, trading in lives until age or karma finally silenced him. What makes his story so unsettling isn't just the evasion, it's the precedent it set. His trick became a blueprint for other monsters. A colonial governor in Bengal would later fake his drowning using identical methods. A pirate captain staged her own hanging, only to reappear years later with a new crew and a dyed beard. The slaver's real legacy wasn't the lives he stole. It was the lesson that monstrous men could slip through history's fingers if they were ruthless enough to burn their own shadows behind them. Yet perhaps there's justice in the way his name rots now. The rebellion he fled, it birthed the first abolitionist laws in that region, the ship he sacrificed to save himself. Its wreckage became a shrine for freed slaves, who tossed his ledgers into the sea like cursed objects. And that vineyard, it's a museum now, its crumbling cellar walls papered with the names of those he tried to erase, proof that while tyrants can fake their endings, the truth has a way of outliving their lies. She dipped her quill in ink not to write, but to wage war, one carefully reasoned argument at a time. The feminist philosopher lived in an age when women's thoughts were considered as fleeting as their emotions, their intellects dismissed as too delicate for rigorous debate. Yet her treatises cut through prejudice like a scalpel, dissecting the absurdities of gender roles with logic so precise, it left her male contemporaries squirming. Take her infamous dialogues on equality, where she demolished the era's favorite justification for women's subjugation, the natural order argument, by pointing to nature itself. Observe the lioness, she wrote, who hunts while the male lazes in the sun. Does the jungle collapse into chaos, or does it thrive on adaptability? Her words weren't just rebellious, they were revolutionary, grounding feminism in observable reality centuries before the term existed. What made her work so threatening wasn't its passion, but its irrefutability. While male scholars framed their biases as divine decree, she wielded their own tools against them: Aristotelian syllogisms, Socratic questioning, even mathematical proofs. A recently rediscovered fragment from her Geometry of Power manuscript applies Euclid's axioms to social hierarchies, demonstrating how self-evident truths about gender crumbled under logical scrutiny. If all men are rational, she penned, and no women are rational, then by what alchemy do mothers teach sons to reason? The margins of surviving copies show where furious readers scrawled rebuttals, only to cross them out in defeat. Yet her erasure was methodical. Official philosophy anthologies omitted her essays, dismissing them as sentimental musings despite their rigorous structure. Lectures that once quoted her were purged from university records. Even her signature rhetorical device, using domestic analogies to explain complex theories, was later plagiarized by male writers who called it kitchen table logic, stripping it of its radical intent. The few fragments that survived did so through subterfuge, pages bound into recipe books, passages copied into the diaries of noblewomen who risked scandal to preserve them. One such scrap, hidden inside a psalter, contains her most biting observation. They silence us not because our ideas are weak, but because they fear how strong they'd become if shared. Modern scholars piecing together her legacy face a paradox. The very tactics used to suppress her work now prove its influence. The sudden prevalence of anonymous Enlightenment era essays defending women's education. The unexplained shifts in certain philosophers' stances on gender after private correspondence with salons known to circulate her writings. Even the ink stains matter. chemical analysis shows several lost manuscripts were deliberately painted over with iron gall ink to obscure her words, a costly effort that hints at just how dangerous her ideas were deemed. Perhaps her greatest victory lies in the echoes we're only now learning to hear. That radical notion that childcare should be valued labor. She framed it as an economic necessity in 1492. The argument that education wasn't a privilege but a societal safeguard. Her metaphor comparing untaught women to locked libraries appears verbatim in a famous reformer's speech, with no attribution. The feminist philosopher taught us a brutal truth, that progress isn't just about speaking truth to power, but surviving the lengths power will go to unspeak you. And though they scraped her name from history's walls, they couldn't stop her voice from seeping through the cracks. Justice wasn't blind in his courtroom, it was weaponized, sharpened into a blade that carved away his enemies with surgical precision. The judge who framed rivals didn't just interpret the law, he twisted it into a noose for anyone who dared challenge his assent. Picture a man in robes, his gavel falling like a headsman's axe, each verdict meticulously engineered to look legitimate while advancing a private vendetta. His true genius lay in exploiting the system's own mechanisms, technicalities, precedent, even the appearance of judicial restraint, to turn the courtroom into a stage where his opponents played unwitting villains in dramas he scripted. The depth of his deception only became clear decades later when archivists uncovered his private docket notes. Scribbled margins revealed cold calculations, charge under Statute 12b too vague for appeal, or witness prone to suggestibility, ideal for coaching. One chilling entry listed potential jurors by occupation, with asterisks marking those whose livelihoods depended on his political allies. These weren't the musings of a biased judge, they were blueprints for legal assassination. His most infamous tactic, the precedent trap. By securing convictions on flimsy evidence, he established rulings that future courts would reluctantly uphold, warping jurisprudence for generations. A merchant acquitted of smuggling might suddenly find himself retried under the judge's new interpretation of circumstantial intent, a standard so elastic it could ensnare anyone. What made his reign so insidious was its veneer of legitimacy. Unlike crude despots who jailed critics openly, he weaponized procedure. A rival's son might face disproportionate charges for a minor duel, setting in motion a chain reaction. The family's wealth drained by legal fees, their reputation tarnished by scandal, their political base eroded by whispers of "where there's smoke." Historians poring over old trial transcripts found eerie patterns, certain phrases repeated verbatim in unrelated cases, as if witnesses were reciting invisible scripts. The judge's signature move was the graceful retreat, dismissing charges at the last moment to avoid appeals, but only after the damage was irreversible. A nobleman exonerated of treason still lost his lands to temporary seizure, a maneuver the judge had quietly legalized years prior. The fallout lingers in modern legal systems. Scholars tracing the origins of controversial doctrines often find their roots in his rulings. A seemingly minor decision on property forfeiture became the basis for sweeping asset seizures. His expansion of judicial discretion enabled later abuses by authoritarian regimes. Even his downfall was paradoxically damning when investigators finally exposed him. They used tactics he'd pioneered, setting dangerous new precedents in the name of justice. Perhaps the most haunting lesson lies in the silence that followed. The cases he rigged were never retried. The reputations he destroyed stayed shattered. Law schools still teach his rulings without mentioning the whispers of coercion behind them. That's the real cost of corruption, not just the lives ruined, but the way it poisons the very tools meant to protect us. Because when the law becomes a weapon, even the innocent start flinching at its touch. And long after the judge's name faded from memory, the shadows he cast still stretch across courtrooms today. He arrived in the ruined city with nothing but a satchel of sketches and the scars of a journey that had cost him everything: his home, his family, even his name. The refugee architect didn't just see collapsed walls and rubble-choked streets. He saw the bones of something new waiting to be reassembled. His genius lay in turning limitations into innovations. When traditional materials were scarce, he mixed pulverized debris with lime to create a stronger, lighter mortar. When narrow alleys prevented heavy machinery, he designed modular structures that could be lifted into place by teams of children and elders. His blueprints weren't just about rebuilding, they reimagined urban life, weaving communal gardens into apartment blocks and designing flood-resistant foundations based on ancient techniques from his flooded homeland. Yet the rulers who praised these reconstructed cities never mentioned the foreigner who designed them. Official proclamations credited local ingenuity and royal vision, erasing the architect's fingerprints from history. A surviving contract from the era reveals the cruel bargain. In exchange for shelter, he surrendered all rights to recognition, his signature replaced by a magistrate's seal. Even the workers who'd hauled his handmade bricks remembered only that quiet man who drew in the dirt, unaware they were breathing life into revolutionary ideas. The most damning evidence of his erasure: two nearly identical sets of civic plans discovered in a forgotten archive, one bearing his precise measurements and marginal notes in a distinctive shorthand, the other scrubbed clean of all identifying marks except the king's insignia. Side by side, they tell a story of theft as calculated as it was cowardly, but the architect's legacy refused to stay buried. Modern engineers studying his hidden techniques made a startling discovery. His rubble-based concrete outperforms modern mixes in earthquake simulations. The communal courtyards he insisted upon dismissed as sentimental folly are now hailed as early models of climate-resilient urban cooling. Even his name survives not in history books, but in the oral traditions of the city's poorest quarters, where grandmothers still point to certain walls and whisper, "The stranger built this." Perhaps his greatest revenge lies in the irony that the very rulers who erased him unknowingly immortalized his work. Their vanity ensured his designs were preserved in stone while their own palaces crumbled. Today, as tourists admire historic neighborhoods, they're walking through the ghost of a refugee's mind, proof that some ideas are too vital to disappear, even when their creator is forced to. The temples stood empty, their holiest relics pried from altars and packed into straw-lined crates like common trade goods. The smuggler of sacred artifacts didn't just steal objects, he severed the spiritual lifelines of entire civilizations, turning devotion into discreet transactions in backroom auctions. Picture a man moving through moonlit ruins with the clinical precision of a surgeon, his tools leaving no marks on stone, only absences where gods once stood. His ledgers read like a graveyard of faith. Lot 27, one bronze votive hand, Thessalian slight verdigris, sold to Zurich collector via Venetian intermediary. What set him apart from common thieves was his understanding of cultural value. He didn't smash and grab, he researched. A recently uncovered diary details how he studied religious rituals to pinpoint when guards would be distracted during festivals. He learned which artifacts were considered too sacred to be photographed or catalogued, making their disappearance harder to prove. His greatest coup, swapping a 9th-century Buddhist statue with a near-perfect replica for 3 months before anyone noticed the original resurfaced decades later as the centerpiece of a tycoon's private meditation garden, its provenance laundered through 4 shell companies. The real tragedy lies in the silent stories. That bronze votive hand wasn't just metal, It was part of a healing tradition where pilgrims placed offerings to cure withered limbs. The Jane manuscript he sold to a Texas oil heir contained medicinal recipes from a now extinct school of herbalism. Like tearing pages from a history book and scattering them to the wind, each stolen piece carried fragments of knowledge, ritual, and identity that can never be fully reassembled. Modern archaeologists face a macabre puzzle when these pieces resurface. A Cambodian headdress might appear in a museum gala, its gold gleaming under spotlights, but divorced from the temple carvings it once complemented. Its symbolism becomes decorative rather than divine. Carbon dating can confirm authenticity, but no lab can restore the context scrubbed away by generations of private ownership. The smuggler's true crime wasn't theft, it was the creation of cultural orphans, artifacts stripped of their native tongue. Yet the darkest twist emerged in 2018 when a cache of his letters was found hidden in a Parisian attic. They revealed that some collectors commissioned specific thefts to erase evidence of inconvenient histories. One patron paid triple for all artifacts related to a particular goddess, not out of devotion, but because her cult's gender-fluid priesthood contradicted his regime's propaganda. Another sought every reference to ancient interfaith treaties, as if plundering the past could justify modern divisions. Perhaps the smuggler's most enduring legacy is the shadow he cast over museums today. Every time an institution hesitates to reveal how an artifact was acquired, or a curator glosses over gaps in provenance, the echo of his laughter lingers. Because the greatest trick the devil ever pulled wasn't convincing the world he didn't exist, it was convincing us that beauty could ever be innocent without truth. Centuries before crowds marched with placards and hunger strikes became symbols of defiance, one man proved that courage could wear the quietest face. The pioneer of nonviolent resistance didn't raise a sword against the empire crushing his people, he raised questions. His weapon wasn't steel, it was collective stillness, the kind that made spears seem clumsy and armor unnecessary. Imagine a column of soldiers sweating under the midday sun, their shields useless against rows of villagers kneeling in perfect silence, their children placing flowers in the dust where weapons should have clashed. This was resistance stripped bare, no barricades, no bloodshed, just the unbearable weight of humanity refusing to play its assigned role. His strategies read like a playbook for later movements, though history tried to burn the manuscript. When authorities demanded forced labor, he organized work slowdowns so subtle, overseers couldn't pinpoint the defiance baskets woven with gaps, bricks deliberately misshapen to collapse under their own weight. Taxes went unpaid not with shouts, but with entire villages vanishing into forests until collectors left empty-handed. Even his protests were designed to exploit the oppressor's weaknesses. Parades of the elderly blocking roads at sunset, knowing soldiers wouldn't risk the bad press of harming gray-haired grandparents. Every act was a mirror held up to power, revealing its brutality without giving it a target. The empire's response betrayed their panic. Scrolls from the era dismiss him as a mad preacher, but military dispatches tell a different story, orders to avoid direct confrontation, warnings that arresting him might inflame the passive into violence. They couldn't admit the truth that his methods had them cornered. Violence against armed rebels was justified. Violence against singing schoolchildren was a propaganda nightmare. So they erased him instead. His name was scrubbed from records, his followers labeled as bandits, his tactics misattributed to local superstitions. For generations, his legacy survived only in folk songs and bedtime stories, where foxes outsmarted wolves not with teeth but with patience. Rediscovery came through sheer stubbornness. A 19th-century scholar translating merchant ledgers noticed odd gaps in production during certain years, no riots recorded. yet entire quarries stood idle. Digging deeper, he found whispers of the quiet rebellion in marginal notes. Slowly, the fragments coalesced, tax collector logs complaining of uncooperative smiles, garrison reports fretting over unarmed crowds that scatter like mist. The pioneer's genius had been hiding in plain sight, his victories masquerading as bureaucratic inconveniences. What makes his story so electrifying isn't just the antiquity of his methods, it's how they unravel the myth that nonviolence is passive. His protests weren't about surrender, they were jiu-jitsu for the soul, using the oppressor's momentum against them. When soldiers smashed looms to suppress weaving protests, his followers spun thread barehanded in public squares, turning broken tools into theater. When speaking his name was banned, people stitched his silhouette into quilts and carved his profile into bread crusts. The harder authoritarians tried to stamp him out, the more his defiance mutated, proving that ideas clothed in vulnerability can be bulletproof. Modern activists tracing his footsteps face a haunting question. How many other blueprints for peace were buried under the louder narratives of war? His legacy whispers that sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't storming the gate, it's refusing to acknowledge they ever held power over you in the first place. History is written by the victors, but sometimes it's ghostwritten by the people they paid to flatter them. Enter the biographer who rewrote lives, a man whose quill was mightier than any sword when it came to carving reputations. Picture a shadowy figure hunched over parchment in some noble's candlelit library, transforming petty tyrants into paragons of virtue with a few strategic strokes of ink. His genius and his crime wasn't just in what he added to the record, but in what he meticulously scraped away. A warlord's massacre became a necessary pacification. A queen's vindictive purge was reframed as judicious housekeeping, and anyone who dared oppose his patrons, their biographies mysteriously sprouted chapters on cowardice, madness, or scandalous liaisons with the kitchen staff. The real horror lies in how thoroughly his fabrications took root. Take the case of Duke Hector of Montrose, a man so notoriously cruel his own hounds cowered at his approach. The biographer's commissioned life story painted him as a misunderstood reformer, his brutality recast as firm leadership in troubled times. The proof was in the parchment, doctored letters discovered in the archives, complete with forged wax seals. Poetic verses attributed to the Duke's enemies were subtly altered to make them sound unhinged. Even the Duke's signature, lifted from legitimate documents, was grafted onto kinder, wiser pronouncements he'd never uttered. Within a generation, the lie had ossified into fact. Historians citing the biography unwittingly perpetuated the myth, their footnotes branching into textbooks, then monuments, until the monster had been laundered into a statesman. But the biographer's most insidious trick was his mastery of omission. A rival scholar's groundbreaking treatise might vanish from library catalogues, leaving later researchers to assume the ideas originated with his patron. The charitable works of a maligned politician could be reduced to a single dismissive line, dabbled in philanthropy between intrigues, while pages were lavished on his rumored vices. This wasn't just spin. It was surgical erasure, the literary equivalent of airbrushing dissent from a photograph. Modern archivists have uncovered his methods through telltale gaps, diaries where crucial pages were razored out, or estate records showing payments to anonymous sources who just happened to corroborate his narratives. The fallout still warps our understanding of the past, that beloved folk hero you learned about in school. His humble origins might be a fabrication to distance him from an unpopular dynasty. The villainous Chancellor blamed for a famine. Tax rolls suggest he actually diverted grain to the starving until the biographer's patron needed a scapegoat. Even the phrases we take for granted, everyone knows, historians agree, are often traced back to these orchestrated campaigns of consensus. What chills the bones isn't just the scale of deception, but how eagerly the world embraced it. The biographer thrived because people wanted to believe in noble bloodlines and just wars, in villains who twirled mustaches and heroes who never faltered. His real talent was recognizing that history isn't just written by the victors, it's bought by those who can afford to hire the best storytellers. And in the quiet between his inked lies, a question lingers: how many of our truths are just echoes of someone else's paycheck? Some gifts shine brighter when the giver steps away from the light. The Anonymous Benefactor wasn't just generous, they redefined charity itself, pouring fortunes into the foundations of society while demanding their name never grace a single plaque or cornerstone. Picture a world where hospitals appeared in struggling neighborhoods as if by magic, where school bells rang in villages that had never seen a primer or pencil, yet no ribbon cuttings, no speeches, no portraits hung in gilded halls. This was philanthropy stripped of ego, a quiet rebellion against the notion that goodness requires witness. The scale of their giving only came to light through bureaucratic accident. A clerk in the revenue office, cross-referencing tax exemptions for charitable donations, stumbled upon a pattern: massive sums funneled through a labyrinth of intermediaries, all tracing back to a single, meticulously obscured source. The numbers defied belief: orphanages funded for decades, medical clinics stocked with cutting-edge equipment, even entire libraries built with the stipulation that their shelves remain open to all, regardless of station. Yet the ledgers listed only a string of coded initials, and the rare surviving contract bore a signature more like a cipher than a name. What makes their anonymity so radical isn't just the refusal of credit, it's the precision of the erasure. Unlike patrons who quietly dictated terms behind the scenes, this benefactor vanished into the architecture of their own generosity. Builders received instructions via third-party messengers, with payments contingent on the removal of all donor acknowledgements. Teachers hired for their schools found contracts stipulating they never speculate about their employer's identity. Even the beneficiaries were left to wonder, was it a remorseful tycoon? A collective of idealists, the surviving clues only deepen the mystery. A single letter to a hospital director, discovered tucked inside a donated medical text, reads, "Let the work speak, for voices fade." The brilliance of their approach lay in its immunity to corruption. Without a name to lionize or manipulate, the gifts couldn't be leveraged for political favors or social climbing. A nobleman's attempt to claim credit for one of their schools collapsed when workers testified that the true donor had required builders to swear oaths of secrecy. Meanwhile, the sheer diversity of the projects, from girls' vocational academies in industrial slums to sanatoriums for disabled veterans, suggests a mind that saw need not as a cause for pity, but as a design flaw to be engineered out of existence. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in the rumors that persist centuries later. In one town, elders still tell children that the mysterious Lady of the Ledger walks among them in plain clothes, listening for unspoken hardships. Another village claims their bridge was designed by a beggar who vanished after its completion, leaving behind only a single gold coin in the mortar. These myths aren't just fanciful, they're proof of a truth the benefactor understood, that the purest acts plant seeds in the imagination, growing far beyond the limits of a single lifetime. And so the hospitals still stand, their walls unmarked by any patron's name. The schoolyards echo with generations of laughter, none of the children knowing whom to thank. The Anonymous Benefactor didn't just give wealth, they gave us a riddle that still tugs at the edges of history. Is a selfless act truly selfless if no one knows you did it? Or is that precisely the point? Loyalty was a currency, and he spent it without remorse. The mercenary who switched sides didn't just fight for gold, he weaponized betrayal itself, turning the chaos of battle into a marketplace where allegiances could be auctioned to the highest bidder. Picture a commander rallying his troops at dawn, unaware that the armored figure at his flank had already sold their battle plans to the enemy the night before. By sunset, that same figure might be kneeling before a new patron, offering insider knowledge of his former allies' weaknesses. His wasn't just treachery, it was a brutal form of economic efficiency, where human lives were weighed against purses of silver and the scales always tipped in his favor. What set him apart from ordinary turncoats was his timing. Other mercenaries might defect between campaigns, but he waited for the pivotal moment, the hour when his betrayal would inflict maximum damage. Historical accounts describe battles where entire flanks collapsed because he'd ordered his contingent to fall back at a prearranged signal, creating gaps for enemy cavalry to exploit. His most infamous stunt, during the siege of Blackwater Pass, he arranged for the city's gates to be left unbarred in exchange for a cut of the plunder, then vanished before the looting began. The siege ended not with heroic last stands or negotiated surrenders, but with a whispered deal in some smoke-filled tavern, its details lost to history but its consequences etched in blood. The real genius and horror of his methods lay in their predictability. After a few high-profile swaps, armies began factoring his potential betrayal into their strategies. Generals withheld critical plans from their hired swords. Scouts were ordered to watch their own mercenary captains as closely as the enemy. Ironically, this paranoia became his greatest weapon. Simply by existing, he forced military leaders to distrust their forces, creating divisions that weakened them before a single blade was drawn. A recovered letter from one frustrated commander complains, "Better to fight short-handed than to wonder which of your men's palms have been greased." Yet the most chilling discovery came centuries later when archivists pieced together his ledgers. These weren't the haphazard records of a greedy sellsword, but meticulous accounts listing payments, battle outcomes, and even casualty estimates. One entry notes how switching sides during the Battle of Three Rivers netted him double his usual fee, not just for the betrayal itself, but because the ensuing confusion prolonged the war, making both sides desperate enough to bid against each other for his loyalty. This was betrayal as a calculated industry, with supply chains of informants and middlemen ensuring smooth transactions mid-carnage. His legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places. Modern military contractors still whisper about pulling a verk, slang for abandoning a contract when a better offer appears. The medieval equivalent of non-compete clauses, sworn oaths enforced with threats of eternal damnation, trace their origins to attempts to curb his brand of opportunism. Even the concept of blood money carries echoes of his cold arithmetic, where honor was just another line item on a ledger, perhaps the bitterest twist. The wars he influenced ended long ago, but the lesson he taught remains brutally relevant. In an era where private armies and corporate security forces blur the lines of allegiance, his ghost haunts every boardroom where conflict is commodified. Because the mercenary who switched sides didn't just sell out his employers, he exposed the uncomfortable truth that when war becomes a transaction, treachery is just good business. And in a world that still runs on gold and blood, that might be the most dangerous revelation of all. The village whispered about her before they ever saw her face, a woman who walked the misty hills at dawn, her basket brimming with plants that made physicians scoff and priests clutch their amulets tighter. The herbalist who cured the incurable didn't just challenge medical dogma, she dismantled it root by root, daring to believe that the body's deepest wounds could be met with Earth's quietest offerings. While court doctors bled patients pale for maladies they barely understood, She crushed willow bark into teas that eased pain without leeches, or smoothed fungal salves onto infections that others would have met with a sore. Her crime wasn't incompetence, it was effectiveness, and in a world where healing was a privilege doled out by approved men in powdered wigs, her success became her sentence. Her methods read like rebellion written in petals and thorns. A child's fever broke not with the standard mercury-laced cure, but with a syrup distilled from meadowsweet, a remedy modern labs would later confirm contained salicylic acid, nature's precursor to aspirin. A soldier's festering wound, condemned to amputation, knitted clean under a poultice of honey and moldy bread, its antibiotic properties dismissed as peasant superstition until Fleming's penicillin discovery centuries later. But her gravest sin was her ledger, a battered journal where she recorded not just recipes, but something far more dangerous: patterns. Noticed how certain herbs eased seizures more reliably during full moons. Tracked which springs ran brightest when certain flowers bloomed upstream. This wasn't just folk medicine, it was early epidemiology, a bridge between intuition and evidence that threatened the gatekeepers of proper science. The crackdown was as predictable as it was brutal. Authorities didn't just burn her books, they scorched the very idea of her. A bishop's edict declared her cures the devil's arithmetic, claiming only God should decide who suffered or thrived. Apothecaries, jealous of her influence, spread rumors that her patients survived through luck, not skill. Yet the flames missed what couldn't be captured on parchment: the living library of her students, mostly women, who carried her knowledge in song and story. A lullaby hummed while stirring fever tea contained the recipe in its syllables. A folktale about a fox healing a wounded paw encoded the steps for an anti-inflammatory compress. These weren't just memory aids, they were camouflage, turning science into something too ordinary, too feminine, too domestic to warrant notice from those who destroyed its written form. Today, ethnobotanists combing through oral traditions have stumbled upon eerie validations. A birthing chant from the Scottish Highlands mentions a rare lichen that modern tests prove contains potent coagulants perfect for preventing hemorrhages. A children's rhyme about the lady who talked to mushrooms aligns with recent discoveries about psilocybin's effects on cluster headaches. Even her most maligned cure, a nightshade tincture for restless limbs, mirrors exact dosages now prescribed for Parkinson's symptoms. The tragedy isn't just that her name was erased, but that generations suffered needlessly while knowledge labeled forbidden hid in plain sight, whispered between mothers and daughters, simmered in kitchen pots, tucked into the seams of lullabies. Perhaps her ultimate revenge lies in the quiet persistence of her legacy. Every time a modern researcher discovers an ancient remedy's scientific basis, every time a pharmaceutical company patents a molecule found in some healer's garden, her ghost smiles. Because the herbalist who cured the incurable proved something terrifying to those who tried to silence her. That truth, like wild chamomile, grows back stronger where it's been trampled. And no amount of fire can burn away the memory of hands that healed when all else failed. His sermons began like spring rain, gentle, promising renewal. The false messiah didn't burst onto the scene with thunderous proclamations. He whispered his way into hearts, offering answers to questions people hadn't dared voice aloud. What if suffering isn't destiny? He'd murmur, fingers brushing the forehead of a child crippled by famine. What if the miracles you've been waiting for are already in your hands? Charisma alone couldn't explain his hold. It was his uncanny ability to reflect each follower's deepest longing. To the farmer, he promised fertile fields. To the abused wife, divine retribution. To the intellectual, secret gospels, too sacred for temple hypocrites. His divinity wasn't claimed outright, it was teased, a role the desperate pressed upon him until he reluctantly accepted their adoration. the tragedy unfolded in layers. First came the isolation followers cut ties with unbelieving family, sold property to fund his kingdom, abandoned medicines in favor of his healing touch. Then the tests of loyalty. A mother proved her faith by surrendering her daughter's dowry. A scribe burned his precious books as sacrifice to higher wisdom. Survivor fragments smuggled out in sewn hems describe how dissenters faced purification, locked in prayer chambers until hunger and exhaustion broke their resistance. The most chilling accounts detail his final revelation, that true believers would ascend bodily to paradise if they gathered at the sacred canyon at dawn on the solstice. What happened next isn't recorded in official histories, only in the frantic charcoal scrawls of a shepherd boy who watched from the cliffs as hundreds stepped off the edge, some singing, others suddenly screaming as gravity took hold. The cover-up was clinical. Soldiers burned the canyon's remains to ash, scattering them in unnamed rivers. Scribes were paid to alter census rolls, inventing plagues to explain the missing population. Even the landscape was rewritten, the canyon renamed, its trails deliberately obscured by landslides, but the deepest erasure targeted memory itself. A recovered edict ordered the arrest of anyone repeating false prophecies, defining such speech as treason. Parents taught children to forget the names of lost relatives rather than risk interrogation. For generations, the event survived only in coded warnings, a lullaby about the moon that led lambs astray, a folk tale of the honey-tongued wolf who couldn't bleed. Modern archaeologists piecing together the tragedy face a haunting paradox. The very measures meant to erase the false messiah created a perfect fossil record of fear. Tax receipts show entire villages emptied overnight, yet no war or famine accounts for it. A governor's frantic letter complains of unmarked graves spoiling the silver mines. Most damning, the canyon itself core samples reveal a stratum of charcoal and bone buried under deliberate rock slides, while satellite imagery shows ancient paths converging there like scars refusing to fade. What chills isn't just the manipulation, but its familiarity. His playbook love bombing, manufactured persecution, escalating commitment mirrors modern cults with eerie precision. The difference: today's survivors have forums to compare notes. Back then, isolation made his followers easy prey. Perhaps that's why authorities worked so hard to scrub him from history, not just to prevent copycats, but to hide how fragile societal trust can be. Because the scariest part of the false messiah's story isn't that he existed. It's how easily he proved that divinity is just desperation, polished to a mirror shine. History isn't just a collection of dates and battles. It's a tapestry woven from countless untold threads, each one a life that shaped the world in ways we're only beginning to uncover. These 45 forgotten legends, visionaries and tyrants, healers and con artists aren't mere footnotes. They're missing keys to understanding how power, progress, and resistance really unfold. Take the Scholar Queen, whose libraries held answers to questions we're still asking today, or the Viper of the Java Sea, who outsmarted empires with stolen maps. Their stories force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. History isn't just written by the winners, it's often edited by them too. What does it mean that we remember certain names and not others? The architect of the Crimson Spire designed wonders that defied physics, yet his towers were dismantled stone by stone to build palaces for lesser minds. The Feminist Pioneer taught entire generations to read in secret courtyards, only to have her methods rebranded as innovative pedagogy when men adopted them centuries later. Erasure isn't accidental, it's a deliberate fog that obscures the inconvenient, the challenging, the voices that don't fit the official narrative. But here's the twist. Every time we rediscover one of these figures, we're handed a lens to re-examine our present. The disability rights advocates blueprints for accessible cities, buried under claims of impracticality, now seem eerily prescient in an age fighting for inclusion. The Environmentalist of Antiquity warned of poisoned rivers and dying soil warnings we're heeding too late, but only because his scrolls were dismissed as panic. This isn't just about correcting the record, it's about recognizing the patterns that still shape our world. The Merchant of War's playbook lives on in shadowy arms deals. The false prophet's manipulation tactics echo in modern cults of personality. Yet so do the quiet rebellions, the chronicler of the vanquished proving that defeat doesn't equal irrelevance, the rebel poet whose verses outlasted fire and censorship. These lives remind us that courage and cunning take infinite forms, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to disappear. So whose story stays with you? Is it the puppet master of crime whose web of influence warped an entire society, or the guardian of ancient knowledge who turned survival into an art? Maybe it's the refugee general forced to erase his past to secure his future, a sacrifice that resonates in every displaced community today. Drop a comment below with the legend who reshaped your view of history, and hit subscribe to join us as we keep dusting off the pages the world tried to forget. Because the past isn't settled, it's alive, waiting